Chapter 1. Ah. There's a fresh batch. Cade Cauldron pushed his hat back off his forehead, blew out a breath, and stared down at the pile of horse manure near the toe of his left boot. Seems like I keep missing Moonbeam's deposits, and who in tarnation would think I'd ever worry this much over a steaming pile of crap? There were times he wondered about his life choices, yes-sirree. But, rubbing the back of his neck, Cade looked up. From where he stood, surrounded by the natural beauty of Montana, he could see the mountains looming majestically in the distance, and despite standing over a pile of poop, the air was the best he'd ever smelled. He might not have guessed he'd wind up studying horse manure when he was younger, but he sure couldn't imagine living his life in any other place but Cauldron Valley, Montana. And he certainly couldn't imagine working at any other place than on his family's ancestral ranch. Well, best get to earning my keep. Smiling ruefully at himself, Cade reached for the back pocket of his jeans and the pair of disposable latex gloves he always kept there for just such an occasion. He pulled them on, stretching them over his big hands, remembering lab work he'd done all those years ago at University of Montana. They'd made jokes about the gloves then, and the memory always made him chuckle. Dropping to his haunches, he laced his fingers together to make sure the gloves were snug. Excellent. Time to get digging. Cade barely hesitated as he plunged the fingers of his right hand into the pile. Still warm, that was a good sign. Flies had started to gather, so as he pulled a handful of the manure out to spread it across the dirt, he pulled his hat off with his left hand and waved it around. A few of the more tenacious pests refused to budge, but at least he could see now. Looks pretty good. You know, for crap. Moonbeam was pregnant with twins, which was rare, and more than a little dangerous. Cade and his cousin Jim, the ranch's horse trainer, had spent the last 9 months making sure she was as healthy as possible. 2 more months to go, although they expected her to pop early, if Cade's research was any indication. Multiple full births tended not to go to full term, much like humans. Heck, Cade should know, considering he was one of 2 sets of triplets born at Cauldron Valley Ranch, all in the same week. He and his brothers, Deck and Wyatt, had grown up on the ranch after their parents had been killed in a freak moose hunting accident. The same accident which had also killed their aunt and uncle, who were the parents of the other set of triplets, Bob, Jim, and Ted. The 6 boys had been raised by their grandparents and were all devoted to the ranch as much as anyone could be. Each of them worked on the ranch, and were all just as worried about Moonbeam as Cade was. Cade studied the manure and determined it looked as though she was getting plenty of alfalfa, but he was worried over how much was going through her. Without the proper amount of protein getting to them, Moonbeam's foals might not be growing as well as they needed to be. He slid the hat back on his head and reached down with his other hand to pull apart a particularly dense clump. He frowned down at the mostly digested evidence of the mare's health, and began mentally cataloging the supplements he could identify. Cautiously, Cade lifted the clump to his nose, sniffing, even as he crumbled it between his fingers. The texture and smell wasn't bad, not great, but he'd seen much worse from other pregnant mares, and probably nothing to worry about. Snorting softly, he tossed the remaining clump down onto the pile, startling even the most stubborn flies into taking flight. Nothing to worry about? Cade didn't need an excuse to worry, he was good at it. He draped his forearms across his knees, leaned back on his heels, and frowned down at the pile of manure. All in all, Moonbeam seemed healthy. He watched what she ate carefully, but it was good to see exactly how much she and her foals were actually getting out of it. Or rather, what was coming out of her. She'd been one of their top racers 3 years ago, and Jim had gotten a mint from the buyer who'd purchased her last foal. Jim had mated her with the Flash, another champion, last fall and had high hopes for this breeding, even before they'd discovered she was pregnant with twins. Something in the water, Pops had said with a chuckle, but the Cauldron cousins hadn't been too surprised over the bonus foal. All their lives, they'd known there was something a bit magical when it came to Cauldron Valley Ranch. Whether it was the water's fault or not, it certainly hadn't hurt Cade's career any. The supplements he grew here, or rather, oversaw the growing of, at least, did really well. And they were the reason he'd been able to start his own nutrient company on the side a few years back, selling his custom blends to neighboring ranches and beyond. As the fame of Cauldron Valley's racing horses grew, so too had the popularity of the cousins' individual enterprises. Dec couldn't keep up with the demand for his leatherwork and custom saddles, for instance, and Cade's business was doing so well, he'd had to hire a manager just so he could keep his attention on the ranch, where it belonged. Maybe I should market this pregnant mare mixture I created for Moonbeam. It wasn't the first time he'd thought of it and wondered if he had the time. Handling a twin pregnancy would be difficult, but the wind shifted, blowing the smell of the manure back at him, and Cade felt the corners of his lips tugging upward as he pushed himself to his feet. Time for lunch anyhow. Better get back to the office, Anne. He turned, and nearly dumped his pretty, and unexpected, observer on her butt. Whoa there. The words burst from his mouth as he thrust out a hand to steady her, but she screeched and jerked out of his reach, which ultimately ended with her on her but anyway. He cursed under his breath when he realized he was still wearing the blue latex gloves, covered in crap, no less, and she, rightfully, didn't want him touching her. Which meant, when she did lose her balance and go sprawling on her butt, he couldn't do anything but stand there and watch. They made a hell of a tableau, the two of them, frozen there the way they were. Him, still standing, tall and useless, with his blue and crap-covered hands spread wide and a wince on his face. And her, staring up at him, shocked and sprawled in the dirt. At least she missed the manure. Jami had arrived at the ranch only a few days ago, accompanying Dr. Lachelle Simpson, a matchmaker businesswoman, who'd arranged Cade's cousin Bob's marriage. Bob had been married on Saturday, to a woman he'd only met once they were at the altar. Dr. Lachelle brought along the prettiest assistant Cade had ever seen, and her name was Jami Boatright. He simply stood there, staring down at her, unable to make his voice work. "Were you smelling that horse poop?" she finally blurted. He winced again. "Sorry, yeah, I mean. Sorry." Cade's brain finally began working again, and he scrambled to remove the gloves from his hands, expertly turning them inside out to keep the manure germs inside. He shoved one inside the other, while begging his heartbeat to steady, so he might appear smooth. Smooth? Too late for that, she caught you sniffing crap. Clutching the gloves in his left hand, he reached down with his right. Again, "I'm real sorry. Are you okay?" She hesitated before reaching up to take his hand, and he tried not to wince again. But the moment her hand was in his, Cade noticed a fizz of energy crawl up his arm. Her big blue eyes met his, and all the air suddenly disappeared. What the heck? This is Montana, where the air is clean and plentiful, Anne. Oh. He'd forgotten to breathe. So after sucking in a deep gulp of desperately needed air, he managed to lift her effortlessly to her feet. But for some reason, he couldn't seem to release her. And, this was interesting, she didn't seem too eager for him to let her go either. So they stood there, near a pile of poop, and simply stared into each other's eyes, while he also remembered to breathe. Cade had met Jami at the reception, thanks to Dr. Lachelle's introduction, and absolutely had not noticed the sparkle in her amazing blue eyes, or the way her hips were rounded in all the right places. Or the fact her boobs were. Whoa there, cowboy. Pops raised you to be a gentleman. Jami glanced down at their joined hands for a moment, before apparently realizing they were still connected. She flinched and jerked away again, and he let her go quickly, as if they'd both just been burned. Sorry, he mumbled again. He ducked his chin and hoped he wasn't flushing. When she stepped back and shoved her hands in her back pocket, he tried not to feel hurt. So you were, studying the poop? It was hard to meet her eyes. Yeah. I needed to check Moonbeam's digestion, and this is the easiest way. A relieved laugh burst out of her, and before his very eyes, she relaxed. She was wearing a pair of khaki shorts and a white button-down, which managed to look both elegant and casual all at once. When she tilted her head back with a chuckle, the sunlight caught the small pearls in her earlobes, and he liked the fact they were the only jewelry she wore. Oh, thank God, she laughed. I thought you were some kind of weirdo or something. He couldn't help but chuckle along with her. Well, Wyatt would be the first to tell you I am a weirdo. She waved a hand dismissively. It's not weird to be invested in your work. It just hadn't occurred to me that there might be a good reason for, She jerked her chin down to the pile behind him. I do admire how seriously you take your job though. Oh. Well, now he was pretty sure he was blushing. Thanks. He tried to shrug modestly, but wasn't sure he'd managed to pull it off. I guess, Moonbeam and the other Maras, they're the ranch's future, They've always been our future, and we're really careful to take care of them. And you're in charge of their feed, right? You're a nutritionist? I have my degree, yeah. I thought about veterinary school, once, but it was going to keep me away from the ranch for too long, and I didn't want that. So we rely on Doc Holloway in town for all the medical stuff, but Jim and I handle all the rest. She was nodding, and although she shifted her weight, purple-painted toes peeked out from her sandals when he glanced down, she didn't seem anxious to leave. And did I hear Bob say you own your own company? His brows inched up, surprised she cared enough to remember, and Cade nodded. Magic Meals. It used to be a joke when we were younger that I had the magic touch, when it came to mixing the right amounts of grains and powders and supplements. So I started the company a few years back, and it's going pretty well. That's amazing. A scientist and an entrepreneur. A surprised laugh burst out of him. I dunno about that, he managed sheepishly, unconsciously rubbing at the back of his neck. But the profits pay for the company, the acres of oats, plus everything else we have to buy, and there's always a little extra left over. And I'll bet Moonbeam is one of your favorite customers, huh? Boy, she really seemed interested in all this, didn't she? We're used to dealing with pregnant Maras, but Moonbeam's a special case, because twins are pretty rare. Her blue eyes sparkled as she grinned up at him. Triplets too, I'll bet. There must be something in the water around here, huh? And then she winked. And Cade suddenly knew he was in trouble. Jami, Dr. Boatright, he corrected himself, was pretty, yeah, but no prettier than, say, Tessa, Bob's new wife. Definitely on par with Cade's ex-girlfriend, Bianca, as far as looks went. But Jami had this vibrancy to her, which made her delightful to be around. Maybe it was her smile, or maybe it was her energy, he wasn't sure. All he knew for certain was, for the first time since Bianca had broken up with him 2 years ago, he'd found a woman he couldn't stop staring at. Like right now. When she was smiling at him, and he was standing here, holding poop-covered gloves in one hand and staring at her, open-mouthed. He mentally kicked himself and jerked hard enough to displace his hat. He had to be blushing as he reached up and pulled it off, not even caring if it made him squint against the Montana sun. If she could stand it, so could he. So, hey, I need to go wash my hands, he weakly gestured over his shoulder toward his office. And just like that, her gaze became shuttered, and she stepped back. Oh, yeah, of course. It's cool. I'm sorry for keeping you. Her eyes dropped to his chest. I'll let you get on with your... No. Cade wasn't sure where the denial had come from, but once it was hanging there between them, once she'd glanced back up at him with something, was that hope, in her eyes. Cade swallowed. I mean, he blew out a breath. It's almost lunchtime. Do you have plans? Mutely, she shook her head. Great. Then he winced, yet again. Not great. I just meant I don't have any plans, other than the sandwiches I have in the mini fridge in my office. Would you, maybe? He knew he was making a hash out of this. Taking a deep breath, he blurted out, would you want to join me? If you still have questions, I mean. When she blinked, she looked a little confused. You want me to eat your lunch? No, I made 4 sandwiches today. You must have been hungry. 2 of them were for later, when he got hungry around 3 o'clock, but he just shrugged. He'd much rather share them with her. Would you like to have lunch with me, Jami? He asked softly. A grin split her face once more. I would really like that, Cade, if you're sure it's no trouble. When she smiled like that, she was even prettier than Bianca, now that Cade thought about it. Not that he was spending too much time thinking of his ex at that moment, however. No, he was thinking more about how tight his jeans had gotten at the sight of her wide lips and couldn't help imagining doing all sorts of other things with those lips. He also wondered how her hips would feel in his hands and what sounds she'd make when he touched her. Would she scream his name? It's just sandwiches, Cade. Try not to get ahead of yourself. His tongue darted over his lower lip. No trouble, he managed to choke out from his very dry throat. Was there beer in the mini fridge? If not, he needed to rectify that, because a cold brew sounded amazing just then. Well, okay then. Lunch. Right. Right. He could handle lunch. She was just a guest at the ranch. That was it. A guest who'd expressed an interest in his work. A guest who might enjoy learning more about the ranch and their legacy. Right. Sandwiches. He could do this. Chapter 2. Cade's office wasn't so much an office as it was a laboratory. A smelly laboratory at that. As she waited for him to wash his hands at the big utility sink, Jami looked around. The office was tucked in the back of the stables, so that explained the overwhelming horse she was smelling. But the tables in the room were stacked with all sorts of. Well, she supposed they were types of feed, but to her, they just looked like grass. Maybe oats, but that one looked a lot like something she'd once seen on a breakfast menu at a hipster vegan restaurant. You really don't mind spending your lunchtime with me? Mind? When he was looking all adorably awkward. I'm thankful for the invite, she assured him with a smile. He turned to a mini fridge tucked next to an obviously well-used desk, and as he did, he bumped into a table, which held beakers and other mad sciencey type stuff. She was intrigued, she had to admit, but since she was also hungry, and when are you not hungry, girl, Jami stepped up to the sink and gave her hands a good scrubbing as well, once he'd finished. He grabbed a little cooler from the fridge and beckoned her out the door. Relieved to discover they weren't going to eat in the pungent office, she happily followed him out into the sunlight, where she squinted a bit from the brightness. He assisted her into a beat-up golf cart, then went around and slid behind the wheel. Before starting the tiny vehicle, he first reached into the console and pulled out an equally battered baseball cap for the University of Montana, which he handed to her. Jami was struck by his sweetness. He'd obviously noticed her reaction to the sun's rays and quickly fixed the problem. Was this his own hat? He'd lent her his hat? Of course, she thought, eyeing his big cowboy hat, it was clear he didn't need it right now. Cade then drove them away from the stables and began pointing out parts of the ranch as they passed. Jami was utterly enthralled, and not just because she thought he had a lovely voice. It was more than that, the ranch was absolutely gorgeous. She'd been staying at an hotel in town with Dr. Lachille, as always, and when they had been invited back to the ranch today, Jami had jumped at the opportunity to walk around the massive property. Which is how she'd found Cade. Sniffing poop. Smiling at the silly memory, she pointed to a building farther away. Is that the racetrack? That's part of it, yep. The track's behind the building, but that area is also where we host the county fair each year. He took one hand off the steering wheel to point. After we harvest that field there, we use it as a parking lot. And if you look that way, you can see the stands for the racetrack. Your brother Wyatt lives there, right? She'd met him on Saturday at the wedding reception. The one that kinda looks like you? But Cade was much cuter, with those little worry lines across his forehead. Kinda? He glanced at her with a raised brow. Yeah, he has an apartment up there, and technically, we're identical. We started out as fraternal twins, us and Wyatt, but Decker and I split. So we became triplets, with Deck and me being identical twins within. Holy moly, sorry. He shook his head. I probably sound like an idiot. I guess I spend too much time listening to Bob go on about genetics. She was smiling, but not at him. I think it's interesting. Did you know that the multiples gene comes from the mother side of the family? So y'all ended up as triplets, because of your moms. He hummed and shrugged. I'll have to ask Bob about that. I can admit the family's a little weird. Not as weird as some people's reactions to y'all. This time she let a little chuckle escape as she shook her head. OMG. At the reception, when I saw people licking their fingers and holding them up like that salute from the Hunger Games, such a silly superstition, I thought I'd die. That is so gross. They do it because they're afraid of you? Well, not so much afraid, as superstitious. The golf cart bumped off the dirt road he'd been following, but she could see the ruts in the grass they now traveled over. It's silly, yeah, and it sure has made dating difficult, let me tell you. I can imagine. Do they at least wash their hands before they lick their fingers? Well, every once in a while, there's a big run on hand sanitizer. She chuckled again. Next, you'll tell me there's a high demand for some other necessity, like toilet paper or something. He was smiling when he eased the cart up over a rise. This is what I wanted you to see. Jami turned her head and gasped. Spread out before them was the most beautiful view. The land sloped off sharply, she wasn't sure if they were on a bluff or butte or what, wasn't even sure what the difference was, but everything was green and lush, the fir trees broken by big boulders, which looked like they might have rolled from where the cart was now parked. And in the distance, the mountains still had snow on their peaks. This is gorgeous, Cade, she whispered, eyes wide. I know, he replied in a low voice. It's my favorite place on the ranch. Finally, she dragged her eyes away from the view to smirk at him. You mean, your favorite place, which doesn't have poop? He wrinkled his nose as he glanced around. I dunno, there's probably poop here too. He reached for a bottle of hand sanitizer from inside the console. I really am sorry for earlier. I'm not usually so clumsy, but you surprised me. He is just so adorable when he's blushing like that. Well, share some of that sanitizer, and whatever's in that cooler, and we'll call it even. Yes, ma'am. He popped open the cooler and placed it between them on the seat. Then he propped one booted foot up beside the steering wheel and started pulling out sandwiches. We've got 2 ham and cheese, extra mayo, and Dijon, 1 PB&J, and 1 ham with yellow mustard and some crushed corn chips. Don't cringe, it's an amazing combo. Giggling, she reached for the first option. I believe you, but I'll leave that one for you. I'll suffer and eat a normal ham and cheese to start. Belatedly, Jami remembered she'd had a lunch date scheduled with Dr. Lashiel and the elder Bob Cauldron, but she just couldn't bring herself to worry over the missed luncheon date at the moment. What do you want to drink? He held up 2 sodas. I grabbed a lemon lime and a cola. She reached for the off-brand red can. Don't you mean Coke? She said with a wink. Cola, Coke, pop, soda, he popped the other can open. So that means you're from the South? Born and raised in Tennessee, but I live in Charlotte now. She took a big bite of the sandwich and hummed in appreciation. This is good, she said around a mouthful. He was fiddling with his sandwich. Charlotte. That's where you, right? Saturday had been a little strange, what was showing up just in time for the wedding. But she'd met a lot of the Cauldrons at the reception, and she supposed some had mentioned her job to the others. Technically, I teach at a local community college, anthropology and history, when they need me to. I bounced around to various community colleges, but I like them because the competition isn't quite so cutthroat, and I can take semesters off to write. Gesturing with his half-eaten sandwich, he'd started with the PB&J, she saw, Cade asked, and you write books about marriage, right? Yep. Jami propped her feet up on the dashboard too and rested her sandwich on her knees. My other books have all been bestsellers. I write about modern marriage, historically and anthropologically, in a way to help people better understand their own marriages. At least, that's how my publisher bills it. I put a lot of psychology and relationship counseling in there as well. Wow. He took a long swig from his soda. So you're researching for a book right now, which is why you're assisting Dr. Lashiel, right? Jami hoped he was genuinely interested, otherwise he was going to get really bored, really fast, because she could talk for hours, if not days, about this particular topic. This book is going to be on modern marriages, those which are made quickly, much like your brother's was. Of course, his was arranged by Dr. Lashiel. Before I met Lashiel, I'd spent some time down in Everland, Wyoming, with the Guild of Godmothers. Do you know them? There was a lot of weirdly magical stuff which went on with their matchmaking, but when Cade shook his head, she decided not to go into all the details and would just give him a quick summary. Well, they specialize in matching up people, mainly orphans, because it has something to do with narrative causality, who want to get married, even if they don't realize it sometimes. It's some real fairy tale level stuff. But Dr. Lashiel is an honorary member, so they hooked me up with her. So that means you can, like, work anywhere you want, huh? Cade looked away from her to gaze out at the view in front of them. That must be freeing. For now, I just tag along with her when she travels. Her base is in New York City, but it seems like she's traveling every other weekend for an interview or wedding. So I ride at home, then tag along on a lot of these visits, but the airfare does get expensive. Charlotte's a hub, which is nice. Dr. Lashiel is going home tomorrow, so it looks as though I'm free for a while. I guess that means I don't have to go when she leaves, if I don't want to. The last part had been more thinking out loud than anything, but when Cade's eyes jerked back to hers, she realized the potential in what she'd said. He swallowed heavily, even though he hadn't taken a bite. I'll miss you when you do have to leave. Oh. She found herself mesmerized by his startling green eyes she swore changed colors at any given moment, and whispered, I'll miss you, snap out of it, for crying out loud. I mean, I'll miss this place, she said, in an effort to cover up her blunder, as she whipped her gaze back to the vista. It's gorgeous out here. Both of them took big, awkward, silent bites of their sandwiches at the same time. Then they each silently chewed the same bite, for what seemed like forever, and avoided meeting each other's eyes. After several long moments of this, Jami simply couldn't stand it a second longer. To break the awkwardness, she swallowed and bumped his shoulder with hers. So tell me something about you, something I don't know yet. That wouldn't be hard, there wasn't a whole lot she did know about him. He didn't have to think too long. I won Best Lie 3 years running at the county fair. Well, that was a revelation. You did what? He shrugged, still not looking at her, as he reached for the corn chip sandwich. Why, it says it's because I look so honest and worried all the time, no one believes I could be lying. That surprised a laugh out of her. I can totally see that. You do look honest and worried all the time. He was smiling, and she reached up to not quite touch the skin around his eyes. I love these little worry lines you have, they make you look cute. When her fingertips fluttered upward and brushed against his forehead, he stiffened, and she realized what she'd done. Just like earlier, when she'd landed on her butt, and he'd helped her up, a warmth, a fizzle of something, had shot up her arm from where their skin had made contact. Wow. Startled, she jerked her hand away from him, then shoved half her sandwich in her mouth, to cover her awkwardness. So, he cleared his throat. You write about modern marriage, huh? Okay, good, I can talk about this subject without making a fool of myself. I hope. Carefully, she took a sip of her soda before trying to speak, preferably without stammering. For this book, I'm discussing marriages of convenience. It's actually rather common these days. Like Bob and Tessa? His cousin, Bob, had been the one who had contracted with Dr. Lashiel at Matrimony, a modern mail-order bride service. Sort of. The couple had met for the very first time right at the altar, a rule Dr. Lashiel insisted all who hire her agree to, and the two newlyweds had seemed to be a good match, judging by how long that kiss lasted at the end of the ceremony anyway. They'd left early that very morning for their honeymoon, and Jami wished the best for them both. Yep, just like Bob and Tessa. There are a lot of reasons for modern marriages of convenience. Getting health insurance or green cards are two biggies these days. I'm not sure I could get married for those reasons, he said in a low voice, looking back out at the view in front of them again. Okay, well now she was curious. What are the reasons you could, then? He didn't look at her when he answered. My brothers and cousins all want to get married. Well, except Wyatt, but he says he'll never get married. Really? He shrugged. That's what he says. We have $1,000 bet on it, actually. But, he shrugged, as he absent-mindedly crumbled the empty sandwich baggie in his fist. But Pops is on us to marry. She watched all the expressions flit across his face, entranced. Is that enough of a reason? She asked quietly. With a suddenness which startled her, he tossed the trash into the cooler and swung his long legs out of the cart. Let's walk. She scrambled to pop the rest of the sandwich in her mouth, then hurried to catch up with him. It was clear he liked to be in motion, and she could respect that. Those long legs ate up the ground much faster than her shorter ones, but she didn't mind, because he was adorable when he was intensely thinking about something. Cade Cauldron was tall, all right, tall enough she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. She'd especially noticed it when he'd held her hand a little too long earlier that day. Not that she minded. She liked looking at him, with those lovely green eyes, though they were harder to see when he tilted his hat down as he did now to block the sun, and that thick, wavy brown hair. His face was angular, and she hadn't been teasing when she'd said the worry lines made him look cute. They hadn't gone too far when he came to a halt, his legs spread, a hand on each hip, as he stared out over the ranch. Finally, he said in a quiet voice, "This place was built by my great-great-great-great-grandfather." Unable to resist, she quipped, "That's great." He snorted, and his wide lips curled into a slight smile. He settled here, and they named the valley after him eventually. This place is in my blood, and I get what Pops is saying about marrying and having babies to leave it to. I understand that appeal. It sounded as if he was trying to convince himself. But, she prompted. His breath exploded out of him as he tossed his hands in the air. But who has time to find a wife these days? She couldn't believe she was standing on the edge of paradise, having a conversation this intimate, with a near stranger. But on the other hand, that's what her books were about, weren't they? To help complete strangers understand their own marriages a little better? Thinking about her books, she slowly formulated her next point. Well, that's why Lachille's company exists, you know. You could sign a contract with her and go through her tests. Cade swung around to face her so suddenly, Jami bit off the rest of her words. He gave a quick jab with his finger to push his hat up a bit, and she could clearly see his eyes now. His glorious, soul-searing, beautiful eyes. I'd want to meet the woman I was about to marry before we got to the altar, he said in a low rumbling voice, which made her tingle in all the right spots. See if we're even compatible. Have his eyes always been so green? Jami was aware of her pulse pounding in her ears, and she realized she was a little short of breath. Swallowing what she hoped was a sufficient amount of air, she nodded to show she heard him and understood how he felt. Absolutely, she murmured. He held her gaze for a few minutes longer, then nodded once and began to walk again. So how about you? After all you've seen, all your research, what's your thoughts on marriages of convenience? Hurrying to catch up, she asked without thinking. Personally or professionally? He shot a glance her way. Personally, of course. Stepping around a low, thorny bush of some sort, he warned, be careful around these here plants. I should have known better than to bring you out here without jeans. Her heart fluttered, and other places too, at the thought of him worrying over her. I'll be fine. I'm really glad I got the chance to see this place. So. Oh yeah, he'd asked her a question. Personally, how did she feel about marriages of convenience? She blew out a breath as he slowed his long strides in order for her to catch up. Honestly, don't laugh, okay? Never. His expression showed he was serious when he shot a glance her way. Well, I don't understand marriages like the ones Dr. Lachille contracts, to be completely honest. Modern marriages of convenience. I just don't know how anyone can make such a serious and lifelong commitment without knowing the other person really well. He hummed. Does the idea of it scare you? No one had ever asked her that, and Jami remained silent while she considered it. Crazily enough, but no, she finally decided. It doesn't scare me, it excites me. I guess I'm a little jealous. They reached a scraggly fir tree, leaning out over the edge. Jami realized they'd been following a footpath this entire time, though she hadn't noticed it previously. Does Cade come up here a lot? You're jealous of the brides? He asked, heading for the tree. She shrugged. They jump in with both feet, totally embracing their brand new life. They put everything else behind them, and just trust themselves, and Dr. Lachelle as well, that they'll have made the right choice. He was smiling slightly when he reached back a hand to her. Careful here. Step over this big rock. Once she did and joined him right beside the tree, she decided this view was even better than the last. And it was better, because he didn't let go of her hand. So, he said, in that quiet voice of his, you've secretly always wanted to be a mail-order bride? She heard the teasing note in his tone and snorted. No, well, maybe. Peeking up at him, she offered a small smile. It's compelling, you know? Think of the research. I could put all my experiences in the book if I were a bride of convenience. Or even start a whole new line of books. He shifted slightly, his smile turning into a sort of grimace. So could you do it? Are you going to get Dr. Lachelle to hook you up? Why did he look so uncomfortable at the idea of it? And why did his look make her feel all sorts of gooey inside? Goodness, his hand really was strong, wasn't it? She couldn't help giving his hand a little squeeze to see what he would do, and when he squeezed back, her stomach flip-flopped a dozen times in less than a second. Standing this close to him, inhaling his scent, luckily, he didn't smell anything like horse poop, but there was a lot of sun, grass, and aftershave to him. She felt safe. He was still looking down at her, his gorgeous greens piercing her with their intensity. What had he asked? Oh yeah. Staring up into his eyes, she shook her head. No, I couldn't do the at the altar thing, she whispered. Why not? For the same reason you said. I too would need to see if we're compatible first. His tongue flicked out over his lips in a cute, nervous gesture. Compatible? She felt herself leaning toward him. Attraction, she breathed. Attraction? Jami suddenly realized she'd pushed herself up on her tiptoes, as if trying to reach his face with her own. Physical attraction is a strong basis for a marriage. Not the most important part, of course, but without it, it's harder to start an equal relationship. A physical relationship gives you both an idea of what the other likes, and it also teaches you to care about the other's needs. Needs? Was he only going to repeat her? And why did he sound as if he were fighting to hold himself in check? She nodded, her eyes unable to look away from his lips. When his tongue emerged to moisten his lips, she nearly melted on the spot. Physical needs. Sexual needs. His groan made it sound as if he were surrendering, and he finally reached for her. And maybe he would have wrapped those arms around her and thoroughly kissed her. Maybe she would have thrown her own arms around his neck and kissed him back, with all the need and built-up sexual tension she'd been fighting since she'd met him. Maybe? There's no maybe about it. But she never got the chance to find out, because a loud buzz sounded from somewhere behind Cade. Then an even louder noise, much like an insanely large pig snorting, followed. Cade's arms immediately dropped, and he took a step back. He shook his head in disbelief and stared down at her, looking more than a little dazed. Sorry. What? The pig snort came again, and she glanced behind her, wondering if there were wild hogs in Montana she needed to worry about. After the third time it sounded, Cade seemed to come back to himself, because he muttered a curse under his breath and reached for his back pocket. Oh, his phone. Of course. But when he dropped her hand to swipe at the screen, she felt a little jealous. Of a pig sound. Sorry, he muttered again. That's Pop's tone. He set his grandfather's notification tone to a pig sound? He read the text out loud to her. Have you seen Jami? She was supposed to be here for lunch. As soon as she heard the words, Jami muttered a curse of her own and reached for her back pocket. The ringer had been off, but sure enough, she'd missed several texts from Lachelle. Oh no, she moaned. I should have thought to tell them where I was going, I didn't mean to worry them. With a little grimace, Cade pressed the little microphone icon on his phone to record his outgoing text. She's fine. I have her here with me at the Overlook. He didn't mention the sandwich they'd shared, and she was grateful. Deciding they didn't both need to reply to their texts, Jami shoved her phone back into the pocket of her loose khaki shorts. When Cade saw her staring at the back of the phone, waiting for the reply, he moved next to her and held the phone out. Now they both could see the little dots move on his screen, which indicated Pops was typing. "He's so sweet and thoughtful." After a minute, Pop's text popped up. "The Overlook, huh? It's okay, Cade's got her at his romantic spot. Oh, that sounds intriguing. He's an intriguing guy, and I think he likes that little bundle of gum you brought along. No, not you, Griselda, take your time, boy. They make these pictures too damn small. Is this it? No, wait, I see it. Do you think those two are up there exchanging spit? I bet they are. How do I send it?" It took a moment to parse through all that, and Jami figured it out just as Cade groaned and hit the microphone button. "Pops, you're not supposed to record every conversation when you're dictating, period. I'll show you how to do it again when we get back, period." His finger jabbed the send button, and he shook his head. "Again." For the 5th time, he muttered. He glanced up at her. "I'm sorry about that." He sucks at voice to text. Cade was making a habit of apologizing to her, but he didn't have to. "That's okay." She smiled. "At least he texts." "But, why do you think he called me gum?" Cade chuckled, and said, "You know how autocorrect can be." "I'm fairly sure he said yum, not gum." Jami laughed at that, then said, "Still, I think it's great he even tries. My grandmother won't have anything to do with texting, she writes me letters. In cursive." He blinked at her, then slowly shook his head. "This is crazy, but I'm realizing I want to know all about your family and this grandmother of yours. But there's probably not time now, since they're waiting on you." She was already stepping back, toward the golf cart. "You don't have to head back with me. I've taken up enough of your time." She shook her head. "I'm sure you have poop to dig through or something." To her surprise, his lips twitched upward as he stepped to one side and cleared a path for her. "Actually, Missy, I do." Jami swallowed. I like his smiles even more than his worry lines. Just take me back to your office," she managed, trying to sound cool and professional, and not all flustered and lust-filled. "I can walk back to the big house." "Absolutely not." He shot her a full grin over his shoulder, and she almost stumbled. "Pops and Grams raised me to be a gentleman. I'll drive you to the big house and apologize for keeping you." They reached the cart. "I kept myself," she corrected softly, hating the idea of him taking the blame. "Well then, I'll apologize for feeding you lunch when you already had plans. Griselda might be clumsy as all get out when it comes to Pops, but she makes an amazing chicken salad." His light and playful tone made it easier to pretend that, whatever the heck that had been beside the fir tree had never happened. So she tried for a nonchalant shrug. "I am a sucker for amazing chicken salad." As he started the golf cart and turned it back downhill, she kept blabbering. "I'm a sucker for food in general, which probably explains the size of these thighs." Her hand smacked her thighs, and his gaze followed. His eyes lingered on her legs a moment too long. "I don't mind the size of your thighs," he murmured. And then, as if he just realized what he'd said, he flushed again. But he didn't apologize this time, and the knowledge he liked the way she looked, and wasn't going to apologize for it, made her heart speed up. "So, are you going to join us for lunch?" Because, yes, she was definitely going to sit and eat some of Griselda's amazing chicken salad, and whatever else they had. She liked food, and she wasn't going to apologize for that. So sue her. But Cade was shaking his head. "Probably not. I have a concoction I'm working on for Moonbeam, and I still need to run some numbers for Magic Meals. I had an idea today I think might work out. I'd love to hear about it." When he glanced at her, she realized how dumb she sounded. "Someday, I mean. Not now. I mean, when you're ready to tell me." "Me, or anyone, I mean." "Doesn't have to be me," she stammered. "Like," he held her gaze, slowing the cart. "Like over dinner sometime? And you could tell me about your family, dinner? Like, a date?" Yes, she whispered, her heart pounding. I'd like that. Chapter 3. Cade shoveled another bite of chocolatey goodness into his mouth, just as the front door slammed and Decker called out, "Just me." With his mouth full, Cade didn't bother answering. Besides, he'd already held on to the ice cream far too long and could feel the first pinch of brain freeze. Hastily, he swallowed just as Deck popped his head around the corner. Oh. Cade winced and dropped his spoon to press his palms against his temples. What? He mumbled. You know the way to get rid of that is to press your thumb against the roof of your mouth. How'd he know about the brain freeze? The pain was already easing, but Cade's eyes were still squeezed shut. So he just grunted in acknowledgement. You want to tell me about it? Exhaling, Cade opened one eye and glared at his brother. What? Deck shrugged. You only eat Rocky Road when you're really worried about something. That's not true, Cade mumbled indignantly, reaching for his spoon once more. We always have a half-gallon of the stuff in the outside freezer. Crossing his arms in front of his chest, Deck smiled. He looked as if he'd just come from his shop, judging by the oil stains all over his shirt and jeans. Why do you think I keep that freezer stocked? Because you only eat Rocky Road when you worry. So like, every day. Worrying made Cade feel in command of his life. He knew that. His brothers and cousins knew that. Pops knew that. Hell, even Griselda knew that. So he just pulled the bowl of ice cream closer. I'm fine. Okay. Decker pushed away from the wall. I'm going to shower, then I'll start dinner, since it's my turn. Cade thought he nodded, but he wasn't sure. Vaguely, he listened to his brother head upstairs, to his room, and when the shower turned on, the pipes banged loudly. The house had been built by their father, before he'd met and married Mom. He'd wanted a house to raise his family in, and after they'd died in that shark attack, his sons had moved into the main house with Pops and Grams. But once they were old enough, Cade, Deck and Wyatt had moved back into the home their father had built. The house was fine for a small family, but certainly not for 3 grown men. Once Wyatt had had enough and moved into his apartment. Well, he called it an apartment, but it was really just a room over the betting box at the racetrack. Cade and Deck had much more space. But now Bob and Pops wanted them to marry. No, more than that, they'd all agreed to get married. Cade swallowed down another bite of magical worry-begone chocolate. He'd agreed to get married. He'd agreed to get married and bring his wife back here to this house. Would Decker, as well? Would all of them be able to fit in here? And why was he thinking of Jami? His spoon paused halfway to his mouth as he pictured her here in this kitchen, laughing with him in her bathrobe, as she helped him cook breakfast pancakes. Or curled up on the couch, sharing a bowl of Rocky Road. And why did he have the sudden thought that, if she were part of his life, he'd have less reasons to worry? He was still thinking about her when his brother came back into the kitchen, dark hair looking as if he'd just run a towel over it, wearing a pair of running shorts and... Is that my shirt? Cade asked, frowning at the green Henley. Yep. Deck turned the hot water on. It matches my eyes better than yours. Cade snorted. Our eyes are the same color. We're identical. Don't be silly. I'm buffer. Well, that was hard to argue. Wash your hands. His brother grabbed the soap and threw a mock salute. Aye. Wyatt's coming over for dinner, FYI. Cade nodded, scraping up another spoonful of ice cream from his bowl. Makes sense, since he can barely cook ramen. What are you making? Decker shook his hands dry. Burgers, what else? They lived in Montana. Most of their meals involved some kind of beef. And potatoes. With fries? Of course, but not from scratch. Deck reached into the fridge, pulling out a slab of bacon and a beer. That might seem odd from someone who'd just declared burgers on the menu, but most of the beef and potatoes meals at Cade and Deck's house started with bacon. After all, bacon went with everything. Plus, you could eat it while cooking. Cade glanced down. I wonder how bacon would taste on ice cream. He chased the rest of the melting chocolate around the bowl, rolling his eyes at himself. I sound like I'm pregnant. The thought of babies had him freezing, and not because of brain freeze this time. It was the thought of babies which did it to him. Babies. Not that he could get pregnant, of course, but would Jami like bacon and chocolate ice cream together when she was? Whoa, cowboy, you're getting ahead of yourself. Way ahead. She's going home soon. Actually, he corrected his internal monologue, as he finished off the last spoonful. She'd said she didn't have to go home, and she liked it here. And he thought maybe she'd been about to admit she liked him. So, Decker was standing over the stove, his beer in one hand and the tongs in the other. He didn't look up from the bacon when he said, "If you want to talk about it, now's your chance. You know Wyatt isn't going to let you off without teasing you when he sees you like this." He was probably right. Wyatt was their brother, they'd shared a womb, for gosh sake, but he marched to the beat of his own dang drummer. He was likely the luckiest of all the Cauldron cousins, and he knew how to make bets work for them. He didn't gamble with anyone else outside of the family, but they'd all lost money to him, and had had to do Wyatt's chores, many times over the years. And he was very, very good at figuring out what you didn't want to talk about and nagging you until you did anyway. So Cade blew out a breath. He knew he'd feel better talking to someone, and it darn sure wasn't going to be Wyatt. "I had lunch with Jami." Deck hummed thoughtfully but didn't look up as he turned a slice of bacon over. "I heard she had lunch with Pops," he said too casually. "She had 2 lunches. This time Deck glanced at him, with a quick smile. "I like this gal." "Me too," Cade admitted. He liked her a lot. What was it about Jami Boatright, Dr. Jami Boatright, which made him feel like? He shook his head and stared down at his empty bowl. When he touched her, his blood fired in a way he hadn't felt since, well, ever. He thought he'd been in love with Bianca, but she'd just been using him. And no matter how pretty she was, Cade didn't ever remember his body reacting to her the way it did with Jami. There was something about Jami which made him want to rip his shirt open and bang his chest. Wanted to rip her shirt open and nuzzle her softly. Wanted to make her his, and then yell from the rooftops, "Mine." He remembered her explanation for physical attraction, and how important she said it was in a marriage. He even liked that about her, how analytical and professorial she was. Any woman who could talk about lust the way she had sure was interesting, huh? It wasn't until Decker cleared his throat that Cade looked up to see his brother's raised brow, and realized he'd just admitted, out loud, to liking Jami. He opened his mouth to backtrack, but his brother just shrugged and turned back to the bacon. "So what are you going to do about it?" Cade pushed away from the table and took his bowl to the sink. "About what?" he asked, pretending to misunderstand as he rinsed the remains of the chocolate out. "About liking her." He wanted to deny it, and to say it didn't really matter, but that's not the words which came out of Cade's mouth as he put the bowl in the dishwasher. "I'm taking her out again tomorrow." "Good for you," his brother immediately said, his attention still on the bacon. "I'll see if Griselda will feed me instead." Turning, Cade crossed his arms and rested one hip against the counter. "You're not weirded out? By you dating?" Deck questioned, as he lifted one piece of the bacon out of the pan and moved it to a paper towel he'd already laid out for just that reason. "By me, asking a gal I just met, out on a date. Bob just married a gal he'd only just met," Deck pointed out, moving the remaining bacon out, piece by piece. "So you're at least a little more normal than he is. Doesn't take much." Deck pretended to lick his fingers and stick them in the air, a reminder of the stupid superstition in town, which made Cade snort. Then he blew out a breath and shook his head. "You really?" For the first time, Deck turned to face him, mirroring Cade's pose from the other side of the kitchen, and reached for his beer again. "Listen, I think it's good you're taking Jami out. I wasn't kidding when I said I liked her. She seems like a nice gal." Cade nodded. "She is. I think she's pretty interesting and very smart. And not bad to look at either." At Deck's wink, Cade felt his hackles rise. He straightened away from the counter, only to have the fight go out of him when his brother smiled. "See? Decker gestured with the beer bottle. You're already thinking of her as yours. The 6 of them were born 5 days apart. They'd grown up together, all in the same house, and they even shared the same grade at the local schools. Despite the townfolk's weird superstitions, there had been more than a few instances of 2 of them liking the same girl, but this felt different. You're thinking about marrying her, aren't you? Decker asked softly. Throwing his hands up, Cade growled in frustration. How could I not think of marrying her? He stomped to the fridge and wrenched it open, grabbing a beer for himself. But instead of opening it just yet, he rolled the cold bottle between his hands. Bob just got married, and Pops is giving us grief. And even you're saying you want to get married. Deck shrugged easily, as if this were no big deal. As if he wasn't worried, even a little. I want kids. Seems like the simplest way to get them. He turned back to the pan and began placing more bacon in the hot grease. As the bacon sizzled and the mouth-watering aroma filled the house, Cade studied his brother's back. Deck was the quietest of them all, and also the most caring. Few others realized it, because he rarely spoke up in public, but he was a good man with a big heart. Since Graham's death, he'd poured everything into his leatherwork and was making a name for himself in the custom racing saddle industry, because he was rumored to be a little bit magical when it came to knowing what horses needed in order to win. But there was a lot more to Cade's brother than big shoulders, calloused hands, and that beard. Apparently, under all that, there was a man who wanted to get married. Am I the only one who is hesitating? Well, Wyatt had outright refused to marry, so at least he wasn't that bad. He wanted to make Pops happy, sure, and since meeting Jami, Cade was willing to admit the idea of spending the rest of his life with one woman didn't sound all that worrisome. Not if that woman was funny, and interesting, and full of smiles, and had a butt he could look at all day. Like Jami Boatright. With a sigh, he popped the top off the beer and tossed the piece of metal into the recycling. He liked her, he couldn't deny that. He liked the look and feel of her too. But did he want to marry her? Could he see himself spending the rest of his life with her? Imagine her bustling around this house, or writing one of her books in the spare bedroom upstairs. He could turn it into an office easily enough, and she could teach at the college in Helena, or maybe telecommute. Whoa there, cowboy. He took a swig of the cold beer. Could he see her in his life? It would seem that the answer was an unequivocal yes. But did she want to be a part of his life? The thought made his stomach flip over, and he wondered if maybe he shouldn't have eaten that big bowl of ice cream before dinner, because the thought of her not wanting to be a part of his life made him worried as hell. He blew out a breath and took another drink. Guess I'll find out tomorrow. On our date. Chapter 4. Best date ever. Maybe Jami only felt that way because it was Cade she was riding beside, but she'd been really impressed Tuesday morning when he'd texted her with the plans for their date. This wasn't going to be some normal dinner date at a restaurant, oh no. Cade Cauldron didn't work that way. He'd told her to wear jeans and boots, and to meet him at the stables. Well, she didn't have boots, but she wore the only pair of jeans she'd packed for this trip, and a sturdy pair of sneakers, and smeared her face and arms in sunscreen, just in case. And it was a good thing she had, because Cade met her with a pair of horses, he called them geldings, and she fell in love with the sweet-tempered brown one, whose coat matched Cade's silky hair. I'm thinking about his hair now? Well, to be honest, she'd thought about the man all night since their conversation. This morning, when she'd said goodbye to Dr. Lachille, the eccentric older woman had hugged her, then held her at arm's length and winked. Don't think I bought all that nonsense about hanging around Montana for a few extra days, because you like the landscape, but I do, Jami had protested weakly. But Lachille had just clucked her tongue and fluffed her purple hair with one hand, as she reached for her suitcase with the other. You're staying because of that fine-looking cousin of Bob's, aren't you? I'm not even going to charge you for hooking the 2 of you up. Jami had wanted to protest that she and Cade weren't hooking up, but she knew even acknowledging his name would give Lachille the hint she was right. So instead, Jami had pressed her lips together to hide her smile. Apparently, it hadn't worked, because the other woman had chuckled and waved her hand dismissively. I paid for the room through Saturday night. You're welcome. If you're not Mrs. Cade Cauldron by then, you'll have to figure out what to do with yourself after that. And then she was gone before Jami could do more than gape in surprise. Mrs. Cade Cauldron. Was it weird that that's exactly what she'd been thinking about all morning? As much as she'd been thinking about Cade's lips, and his arms, who knew forearms could be so sexy, and his lips. And the way he laughed. And his lips, and the way he made her insides feel when he took her hand in his. And his lips. Why are you staring at me like that? He asked, from atop his horse, a grin on those very same lips. Flustered, Jami searched for something to say. I like your hat. It's useful? Useful? A cowboy hat was useful to a cowboy? Brilliant, Dr. Boatright. Just brilliant. The smile he sent her way told her he knew what she was thinking. But he just turned in his saddle, reached into one of those leather bags dangling from the side of his horse, and pulled out a smaller, more battered version of his hat, and passed it to her. This was mine when I was younger. It should be small enough to fit you. Flattered, she leaned to the left to take it from him, but her horse took that as a command to turn, and her leg brushed against his, before his horse corrected the course. Well, that flustered her even more, and she tried to cover it by jamming the hat on her head. Thank you. I've never thought of myself as small. He didn't speak, so she peeked over at him, and found he was staring at her with admiration in his eyes. Admiration, and something else, something which made warmth pool in her stomach, and somewhere a little lower. Finally, he dragged his gaze down her legs, then back up. I think you're the perfect size. Oh. Oh my. Wow, she croaked. Who would have thought it'd be this warm in Montana in the summer? Cade tossed back his head and laughed, and the sun caught the skin at his throat, just above the top button of his shirt. It can get pretty hot here, that's for sure. Especially when we're out working in the sun. But winter is beautiful too. You've gotta respect the weather, and the cold can kill you easier than the heat, but you'll never see a prettier Christmas than here in Cauldron Valley. She stared, transfixed with his words. I can't wait to see it, she whispered, realizing too late what she'd said. Green eyes cut her way from under the brim of his hat. I can't wait to show it to you. And that was that. They rode in silence a bit longer, and then he began to point out landmarks on the ranch. She saw the place where Jim trained the horses to work with cattle, although she was disappointed to learn modern cowboys used ATVs and pickup trucks just as much as horses, and the start of the fields where Cade oversaw the growing of the oats and barley. And she even caught a glimpse of one of the ranch's horse herds, munching on grass in the distance. Cade led the way, his horse picking carefully along a rocky slope. When they came to a little creek with a shaded patch of grass beside it, Jami sucked in a breath. It's lovely, she breathed. Wanna have a picnic? Grinning, she nodded. I thought you'd never ask. He swung down from the saddle, then hurried to her side. He needn't have worried, she wasn't going to attempt to get on or off the giant animal without his help. Besides, she liked the way his hands lingered at her waist long after she was safely on the ground. But then he flushed and stepped back, clearing his throat, as if he realized what he'd done. I hope you liked Griselda's chicken salad, because that's what I brought to eat. She shot a glance at the pan-shaped piece of metal dangling from the back of his saddle, beside the bag. When she'd first seen it, she'd thought he'd be cooking over a campfire or something, but apparently not. So she just shrugged. Sure. It was amazing, and I loved the curry powder she used. Yeah. He pulled off his hat and ran his hand through his hair. A lot of the meals she cooks were Graham's recipes. She learned them in order to make Pops feel better. But her chicken salad recipe came from her mom, or so I've heard. As he spoke, he pulled down the leather bags from his saddle and began to lay out a picnic on the grass by the little stream. I'm sorry I didn't cook anything for you. Griselda mentioned she had plenty of leftovers and that you seemed to like it. I did make dessert though. You did? She asked in surprise as she joined him, sitting cross-legged on the grass. Sure. He glanced up at her. But you'll have to wait until you eat your fruits and veggies. With a smile, he held up a ripe peach and a plum. She took the plum with a smile, and he bit into the peach. Stretching out her legs toward the water, she slipped off her sneakers and rested her weight on one arm. I'm impressed, you cook. He shrugged. Why not? Dec and I live together, and we share the cooking responsibilities. When one cooks, the other cleans, and that arrangement has kept us from fighting. Although sometimes I think he goes out of his way to make elaborate concoctions, just to make me scrub more pots. She chuckled and watched him lay out the chicken salad en croissant sandwiches, some ruffled potato chips, and a pile of grapes. It was the most appealing picnic she could think of, and when he produced 2 big bottles of ice-cold water, the condensation dripping down the sides, she lunged for one. I think I love you, she declared, as she twisted the top and guzzled down the refreshing drink. It wasn't until she caught him staring that she realized what she'd said. But she didn't take it back. And he didn't ask her to. Instead, he asked about her family, so she told him about her dad and stepmom, how her grandma had been moved into a home a few years ago, and about her little sister, who was in the Air Force. He then told her about the few memories he had of his parents, who'd died when he and his brothers, and cousins, were 5, and how none of them were quite sure how they'd died, so they all made up different scenarios each time they thought about it. Your grandparents never explained, she asked, incredulously, a chip lifted halfway to her mouth. He shrugged. I dunno if it didn't matter, or they didn't think it was important, or what. But Pops didn't tell us then, and whenever we ask now, he changes the subject. It was hard to imagine not knowing how your parents died, but when he started telling her some of the more outrageous theories, she ended up chuckling along with him. Eventually, they began discussing their favorite movies. They both shared a love for comedies and books, where their tastes differed wildly. They quizzed one another on preferred foods, music, dream vacations, and the most interesting places they'd traveled. It turned out she'd traveled more extensively than him, and his intensity when he asked her about the places she'd seen made her want to take him on her next trip. By the end of lunch, she felt as if she knew him as well as any old friend. But then he pulled out a chilled container of homemade chocolate pudding. Did he have a cooler in those saddlebags? And she darn near swooned. They had to eat out of the same container, but she didn't mind, because it meant he'd scooted next to her, and their shoulders touched when they both dipped their spoons in at the same time. They were comparing favorite recipes when they finished scraping the bottom of the plastic bowl, and Jami knew her earlier words hadn't been false. She could see herself falling in love with Cade Cauldron, given half a chance. Mrs. Cade Cauldron. There was Dr. Lashiel's voice in her brain again, and she grabbed for her water bottle to distract herself. So, are you ready for the next part of the date? Cade asked, as he stood up and brushed off the seat of his pants. She tried to ignore his bum, but it didn't quite work. He did manage to distract her when he pulled down that weird pan thing from his saddle and went to the stream. She followed. This part of Montana is famous for its silver and copper mines. But Helena was founded around Last Chance Gulch in 1864. The gold miners were here first, and there actually used to be a placer mine right here on the ranch. The river is east of here, but I've always loved this spot on this particular stream, and I've gotten some good flakes out of it. She was getting excited. Are we going to pan for gold? Actual, real-life gold? He grinned. Actual, real-life gold, check it out. When he knelt and pulled off his boots and rolled up his jeans, she jumped to follow his example, and soon she was standing ankle-deep in the frigid stream, eagerly trying her hand at gold panning. After an hour or so, she'd collected about 1/8 of an ounce, and he had about the same amount. Luckily, he'd thought to bring a little plastic screw-top bottle, because if he hadn't, they'd have been taking their find home in the chocolate pudding container. It was the most fun she'd ever had on a date, and it was all thanks to Cade Cauldron. He straightened with a groan and glanced at his watch. If I keep you out here too much longer, you're going to burn to a crisp. Her hands immediately flew to her cheeks, but they didn't feel any warmer than usual, thanks to the hat he'd loaned her. But when he winked, she realized he'd been teasing her. So she stood too and brushed off her knees, trying to keep her expression haughty. Yes, Cade, she declared regally, I am extremely high maintenance and demand coddling. Maybe she'd done a good acting job, because his hand darted out and grabbed her as she tried to turn away, and he tugged her back. I was just teasing, Jami. You're the least high maintenance, I mean, not that you're low maintenance or anything. Flustered, his brows knitted, and he shook his head. I didn't mean. He shut his mouth when her finger skimmed across his brow, then down one cheek, to the little lines around his mouth. I know, she whispered with a smile. I was teasing you too. His green eyes suddenly turned intense, and his other hand settled on her hip, as if holding her in place. The grass tickled her toes, and she inhaled his scent. Jami, he swallowed. I had a really good time with you today. This was the best date I've ever been on. Thank you. I know you said you have to leave soon, but I have the hotel room through the weekend, she blurted, interrupting him. His mouth opened and closed a few times, before he finally managed, oh. Okay then, I guess I have a little time. Time? She hesitated only briefly. Time for what? He swallowed, then he took a deep breath and swallowed again. He released her hand and lifted his fingers to her cheek. And then he swallowed again. Time to convince you to marry me. Her mind went blank, and she was like 90% certain she was doing an impression of a goldfish, judging by his wince. He blew out that breath he'd taken. We're compatible, Jami, I know we are. You know I need to find a wife, and fast, and he shook his head, speaking too fast, trying to convince her. You said yourself you've always been curious about marriages of convenience. Think of your book, think of the research you could do if you married me. It was a heck of a marriage proposal. Her tongue flicked over her lower lip, and she lifted her hand to rest against his chest. You want to marry me because you need a wife? Because I'm here? A wary look came into his green eyes. Yes? And because I think we fit well. I like you, and you just said this was an awesome date, because we're together. It sounded as if maybe he was proposing to her for more reasons than just convenience. A small part of her was jumping up and down and waving its arms, and yelling, What in the Samhill do you think you're doing, missy? You can't marry a man you just met. But a significantly larger part of her, the part which had spent the last 6 months following the Guild of Godmothers and Dr. Lachelle around, scoffed. She was 7 chapters into a book on marriages of convenience, for goodness' sake. She knew how these things worked and had been telling Cade the truth when she'd admitted herself curious about them. She could marry him and get the answers she wanted. Plus, you'd be Mrs. Cade Cauldron. And that was infinitely more appealing than any claims of research. Which was weird, because she liked research. His forearms must be really compelling, to overwhelm her love of research. You're not saying anything, he prompted, looking more than a little worried. Well, no wonder. She'd been flabbergasted. I'm considering, she snapped. And something like hope flashed in his green eyes. Really? I thought maybe you were thinking of ways to hit me over the head and run. She scoffed. What would I hit you with? My shoes are way over there, the gold panning pan is closer. True, she admitted with a shrug. But then I'd have to stop touching you, and I don't want to do that. His hold on her hip tightened, and his hand slid down her cheek to cup the side of her neck. Really? He whispered hoarsely. She might have made a noise like, but wasn't sure. He just smelled so darn good. So, any thought to my proposal? Time for brass tacks, huh? She met his eyes. Cade, I told you I couldn't go through with a modern marriage of convenience without meeting him first, right? Same as you. His nod was immediate. You said you needed to check physical compatibility. I understand that. Before I give you an answer, I think you should kiss me. He was already bending down. I should? She shrugged. Or I could kiss you, but I'm going to require your lips on mine. And then they were. And Jami stopped thinking. Because, oh my heavens, there was no space in her head for thinking at that moment. Only feeling. Cade's kiss. Cade's kiss. Jami melted under the intensity of her response to him. His lips caressed and tugged and loved, and then tongues got involved, and Jami's good sense had to go have a lie down and some chocolate, because oh my heavens indeed. When he reluctantly pulled away, she realized she was all but hanging from him, her arms around his shoulders, and her hair disheveled. He was breathing as heavily as she was, and, goodness, but wasn't that sort of an empowering feeling, knowing she'd made him feel that way? Were his knees as weak as hers? Probably not, but she couldn't manage to make herself stand on her own feet yet. His chest was still heaving when he dropped his forehead to hers, and she decided maybe she didn't mind being so much shorter than him, if it meant he'd keep holding her this close forever. Her toes curled in the green grass, as the world around her came into sharper focus. The sound of the little burbling stream, the taste of the pudding they'd both shared, the scent of his aftershave, she knew they'd all be implanted in her memory forever. This one perfect moment when her life changed. Yes, she whispered. Slowly, he straightened, his gaze intense. Yes, he repeated. She took a deep breath and smiled, knowing she'd never regret this decision. Yes, Cade Cauldron. I will marry you. Chapter 5. Who knew you could arrange a wedding in only a few days? Jami had said yes, after that amazing kiss, on Tuesday, and now look at them. Only a few days later, and his family had taken off work to show up at the church that afternoon. Too bad Bob and Tessa were still on their honeymoon, or Cade knew they'd be there too, sitting beside Pops and Griselda in the front pew. Pops had pulled some favors, and Pastor Dinkelheimler was willing to show up in the middle of a Friday afternoon, with very little notice. Besides the Cauldrons and Griselda, there were only a few others sitting in the pews, and they were mostly Pop's close friends from town. Yeah, it wasn't a real fancy wedding, but it was his and Jami's. Cade swallowed and resisted the urge to shove his hands in the pockets of his jeans. Instead, he folded them in front of his big shiny belt buckle and exchanged a glance with Dec, who was standing beside him. Both his brothers had been willing to stand up next to him, once he'd assured them they wouldn't have to wear suits. They had managed to find blue-checked shirts, which kinda matched his, although he wasn't sure which one had bothered going through the effort. What time was this shindig supposed to start? Cade glanced at the clock above the back door and caught Dec smiling. What? He hissed. So I'm nervous. Always worrying, his brother drawled, with a slow, sarcastic shake of his head. Behind them, the preacher cleared his throat. When they turned, the old man was eyeing them suspiciously. Just like everyone else in this town. Say, Pastor Dinkelheimler, Wyatt began, his tone innocent, what's that the Bible says about loving your neighbor? Startled, the old man turned to Wyatt, licked the first 2 fingers of his hand, and thrust them into the air. Wyatt was smirking as he eyed the pastor's 2 fingers. Oh, nothing, Pastor. Dec rolled his eyes. And Cade blew out a breath, loosening his grip long enough to run both hands through his hair. Well, at least he had tried to look nice for his wedding. Hopefully, Jami wouldn't be too disappointed. Quit worrying, Dec murmured. No, Cade snapped. I can't just quit worrying, he hissed in return. I dunno if this is the right thing to do. It's the best thing. Cade shook his head. Her family isn't even here. From the other side of Dec, Wyatt said in a low voice, listen, you wanted a quick wedding, yeah? Well, so did she. If you're going to do something as stupid as getting married, you might as well get it over with quick. Cade had just opened his mouth to reply when the door in the back of the church swung open and Pop stepped through with Jami on his arm. And all the air seemed to be sucked from Cade's lungs, as she slowly walked up the aisle toward him, without music, but who needed music? Cade silently cursed himself. Had he really thought her as simply pretty at some point? He must have been blind. She was stunning. In that sweet little pink sundress, she outshined everyone else in the church. Hell, everyone in the whole town. Possibly even the entirety of Montana. He'd once thought Bianca was the prettiest woman in Montana, but not now. No one, especially not Bianca, could hold a candle to his bride. When they reached the altar, he realized she was clutching at Pop's arm as if she were afraid of falling. Was she regretting this wedding already? Or was she just nervous? Instinctively, Cade reached for her hand, which Pop seemed happy to place in Cade's. As the old man stepped back, and Jami moved forward beside Cade, he realized he was holding his breath. As if he were outside his own body, he saw himself holding Jami like a lifeline, as they turned to face the pastor. He saw Griselda scooch closer to Pops, saw Jim smile and Ted nod solemnly, and at the altar, Wyatt nudged Decker and rolled his eyes. Pastor Dinkelheimler cleared his throat as he fumbled to open his little black binder. Dearly beloved, clearing his throat again, he got the right page open and started over. Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to join Cade Cauldron. He shifted the book over to his right hand, so he could lick the 2 fingers of his left hand and shove them into the air, and, He blinked at Jami over the top of his spectacles as he slowly lowered his hand. I'm sorry, my dear, but I don't recall hearing your name. Jami dropped Cade's hand and smiled at the preacher, a smile which looked much too innocent. Oh, I'm so sorry, sir. We haven't been introduced. When she thrust out her right hand, she startled the old man, who scrambled to move the open binder to his left hand. In the process, he dropped it, and when both he and Cade bent to retrieve it, they nearly bumped heads. Cade waved him away, and by the time he stood up with the book, the preacher was shaking Jami's hand. Or rather, Jami was shaking his hand enthusiastically, and appearing one step away from full-on laughter. It's so nice to meet you, she gushed. Holding out the binder, Cade tried to get the preacher's attention. Here you go, Pastor Dinkelheimler. Yes. Yes, his hand still being shook enthusiastically by Jami, the old man reached over to take the binder from Cade. Yes, I'm Pastor Dick Dinkelheimler. I've been in charge of this church since your groom was young. Oh, excellent. Jami enthused. And I'm Jami Boatright. Cade leaned in. Dr. Jami Boatright. While the pastor hummed, impressed, and tried to politely pull his hand back, Jami continued to pump it. Yep, Dr. Jami Boatright, that's me, Pastor Dick Dinkelheimler. Shake, shake, shake. And I'm marrying Cade today. Her smile finally bloomed. Cade Cauldron. Cade saw the moment the old man realized he wouldn't be able to do the stupid finger-licking superstition, because he held his binder in one hand, and his other was still being shaken by Jami. But Cade had clearly underestimated the power of the man's superstitious nature. Pastor Dinkelheimler thrust his binder into Cade's hands, quickly licked his free fingers and thrust them into the air, then snatched back the binder. Jami's smile grew. Yes-sirree. I sure am pleased to be marrying one of the Cauldron triplets. With a slight groan, the elderly pastor all but threw the binder back at Cade, licked his fingers and stuck them in the air for a fraction of a second, then yanked the book back. Wyatt and Jim were outright chuckling at this point, and Jami was still shaking the poor idiot's hand. Sighing dramatically, Cade reached out and broke her hold on Pastor Dinkelheimler, and pulled her hand back into his. He winked at her, and as one of the sets of Cauldron triplets, Pastor Dinkelheimler's wet fingers shot into the air again. I'm pleased to be marrying you too, Jami. Now, Pastor, if it's not too much trouble, could you get on with it? The preacher's wet fingers went up and down a few more times for good measure, before the old man seemed to remember where he was. Adjusting his glasses, he fumbled to open the binder once more. Yes. Yes, dearly beloved, where is it? He finally found the right page. Okay, yes. Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to join Dr. Jami Boatright and Cade Cauldron, fingers in mouth, fingers in air, in most holy matrimony. Cade managed not to roll his eyes, but he did sort of zone out. He'd just sat through his cousin Bob's wedding a few days ago, hadn't he? He knew how it went, for richer or poorer, in sickness and health, till death do us part, etc., etc. The only thing different, besides the fact they'd met before meeting at the altar, was that Jami and Cade didn't have rings to exchange. This whole thing had been planned in such a rush, they simply hadn't had the time. He'd promised to take her to the jeweler to pick out a ring as soon as possible, and so they had decided to skip over that part of the ceremony. Each time the preacher used his name, the man had to lick his fingers and thrust them into the air, which got a little monotonous, but eventually they got through it. And then, at last, Pastor Dick Dinkelheimler peered over the top of his glasses, and intoned, "You may kiss your bride." Finally. The part he'd been waiting for this whole time. Remembering what had happened to Bob and Tessa, he reached for Jami, whose blue eyes twinkled with excitement, and was careful to only brush his lips across hers. But she apparently had other plans. Grasping his lapels, she pulled his lips down to hers, which earned her a proud whoop from Jim. This kiss wasn't anything like that amazing one they'd shared by the stream on Monday, but it was just as life-altering. It fired his blood in a way nothing else ever had, and it made him want to beat his chest and crow to the world that Jami was his. Mine, his heart shouted, as his arms wrapped around her. She was the one to pull away, her brilliant smile lighting up the entire church. The blood was pounding so hard in his ears, he barely heard Pastor Dinkelheimler declare them Mr. and Mrs. Cauldron. And yeah, the old man licked his fingers when he said the names, but Cade didn't care. Because Jami was his wife now, and he couldn't decide if that made him more, or less, nervous. But he was a married man now, and he had responsibilities. Turning to the mostly empty church, he tucked Jami's hand in the crook of his arm and held up his other to his family and friends. "Thanks for coming, folks." "Thanks, Pastor Dinkelheimler, from all of us Cauldrons, lick, fingers and air, for performing such a quick ceremony. Sorry there's no reception, but I, and Pops, appreciate you being here for me and my wife today." "It's about time," his grandfather hollered from the front row, which caused chuckles from many others. Cade was smiling when he looked down at his new bride. "Maybe we can do a bigger party, once Jami's folks can come up for a visit. You'll all be invited to that reception." "Don't be silly, boy," Griselda called out from where she stood in the pews by Pop's side. "We're celebrating." She held up a large plastic cupcake container. "And you will have a wedding cake on your wedding day." The entire town knew how good Griselda's cupcakes were, so when she stepped out of the pew, holding up that container, it was no wonder everyone surged forward, including the bride and groom. The older woman was beaming happily as she handed out the mini chocolate concoctions. The newlyweds, though surrounded by many others, were lost in their own world, and each other. "Aren't we supposed to feed one another?" Jami asked impishly, as she waggled her cupcake in Cade's face. Solemnly, Cade pulled back the paper wrapper and held it up for her. Holding his gaze, Jami leaned forward and made a show of biting into the cake. A bit of chocolate icing got stuck on her lip, and when she moaned in pleasure, and her tongue darted out to lick it clean, Cade swallowed with a loud gulp. He was married now, yeah, and that meant there would be a wedding night. But maybe she wasn't thinking about that, because she straightened and began to peel the wrapper off her cupcake and didn't appear to be affected whatsoever. She lifted the chocolate delight up high, then stood on her tiptoes and stretched even higher, because he was so much taller than she, and the twinkle in her eyes should have warned him. But as he opened his mouth to take a small, reserved bite, she hauled off and smashed the cupcake against his cheek. Around them, his brothers and cousins, and all their other guests, erupted in laughter, and Jami began giggling. Cade couldn't get upset with her even if he'd wanted to, but especially not when she looked so tickled, so he just snatched a napkin from Jim, and tried to look stern when he thrust it toward her. "I'll leave it to you to clean this up." She ignored the napkin, and instead, placed her hands against his chest for balance, as she lifted herself up on tiptoes once more. And licked the corner of his mouth. She whispered, and held his gaze with a wry smirk. "I do love chocolate." Past a dry throat, Cade croaked, "Me too," just as she lifted herself up for another lick. And he felt himself grinning. In that moment, he forgot about worrying completely. She was his wife now, for better or worse, richer or poorer, blah blah blah. Jami had a sense of humor and a laugh he knew would keep him from being too serious, as Deck often warned. She'd make him happy. They'd make each other happy. And wasn't that all that mattered? He abruptly stopped laughing when his lips claimed hers, as she came back for another lick of chocolate. Her wedding night, her wedding night. Her wedding night. No matter which way she spun it, Jami had to admit she was nervous. After the mini-reception, and she was pleased Cade hadn't seemed irritated when she'd smashed the cupcake in his face, the two of them had gone into town for dinner. They'd shared a bunch of appetizers from a fancy restaurant and had then returned to her hotel room, where they would soon share their wedding night. At the door, he'd given her a deep kiss and told her he'd return in an hour. She knew it was his way of trying to be polite and to give her some privacy, so why did she feel as if he were abandoning her? Now she stood in front of the long mirror, peering critically at herself. Who would have thought she'd be married? The last few days were a whirlwind, between trying to explain to her father what in tarnation she was thinking and arranging for some of her stuff to be packed and shipped to Montana, as well as setting up a virtual interview with a few colleges in the area. Luckily, she was already on a leave of absence from her last teaching job, so it'd be easy to. Why in the world was she thinking about work now? Taking a deep breath, Jami smoothed a hand down her side, and the feel of the silk against her skin was enough to cause her to shiver. She'd purchased the little nightgown at the same time she'd picked up her new sundress, which she'd worn to her wedding earlier that day. Her wedding. Remembering the appreciative gleam in Cade's eyes when he'd looked her over today, she wondered if he'd think the same of her now. She knew she didn't have a perfect body shape, she was too short and plump to ever be a model, but she'd never worried much about that sort of thing. But when Cade looked at her that way, as if she were a piece of chocolate cake, one he wanted to indulge himself in, without interruption, it made her feel powerful. Desirable. Huh. Maybe I'll have to give up sleeping in flannel Jami pants, now that I'm married. What else was she going to have to change about her life? There was a knock at the door, and Jami's gaze slid immediately to the bed. The big, comfy bed, with the white comforter and all the extra pillows. Sure, was nice of Lachelle to pay for the room through the weekend. She must have known there was a possibility of something. Cade. He was still standing outside the door. Springing into motion, Jami reached the door and yanked it open, hoping she didn't appear too rattled and breathless. But when she saw him, she lost her breath anyway. He'd looked very nice today, with his hair combed and his shirt all buttoned up. But now, in his t-shirt, stretched tight across his chest, and his hair still wet from his shower, he looked positively delightful. Good enough to eat. Or do other things with. His smile turned a little awkward as he held up a bottle of champagne and a plate of chocolate-covered strawberries. I picked these up for you. Can I come in? As strange as all this was, his timid request made Jami giggle as she stepped out of the way and held the door open. Please do. I've been waiting for you. Ugh, why did that sound so weird? But he was smiling when he hurried to the little table by the window. They didn't speak as he made short work of opening the champagne and pouring the bubbling liquid into 2 hotel glasses. When he held one out to her, she hurried across the room. I don't normally drink, you know, but since it is a special occasion. The gulp she took of the champagne was much too big, and she decided it was likely from the heat in his gaze as his eyes raked over her. Oh my. Maybe I should drink some more of this. She might need the fortification. You know, he drawled, setting down his glass without tasting it, with you in that slinky little number, I feel awfully overdressed. She gulped and gripped the glass in front of her with both hands to keep them from shaking. Maybe you should do something about that. Well, all right then, he whispered. He sat down, and as she watched, not sure if she should turn away or look, like some pervert in a peep show, he made short work of pulling off his boots and socks and watch. Then he stood, and holding her gaze, reached for the hem of his shirt. You okay with this, Jami? He asked in a low voice. Mutely, she nodded, knowing her eyes were wide. In one quick movement, he pulled the shirt over his head and, oh my heavens, but he had a lovely chest, didn't he? It wasn't until she was standing in front of him, Jami realized she'd stepped closer to him instinctively. Gently, he pulled the glass from her hand and placed it on the table. Then he touched her cheek, and she thought she might melt. Are you hungry? He asked. Not for food, but there was certainly a kind of hunger building in her. Yes, she blurted, though not sure how to explain it. With a little curl of his lips, Cade reached for one of the chocolate-covered strawberries and lifted it to her lips. He was feeding her. Chocolate-covered strawberries. This was like something out of a movie. As if she were a character in that same movie, Jami held his gaze as she leaned forward, taking a bite of the fruit from his fingers. His little grin grew as he popped the rest of it in his mouth and tossed the stem aside. She licked her lips and followed the motion. "Jami, I have to tell you something," he whispered. Her eyes widened, inviting him to continue. "If I don't kiss you real soon, I don't know what I'll do." Well, that was all she needed to hear. Feeling more at ease now, she lifted herself to her toes. "So kiss me," she whispered. And he did. This kiss wasn't as life-altering as the one they'd shared in the church that day, but it was bursting with all the hunger they shared. His lips moved atop hers, he tasted of chocolate and wasn't that lovely, and his tongue teased hers. She wrapped her arms around his neck and held on. When he squeezed her closer, lifting her off her feet and up against his chest, the sensation of his skin against the silk of her nightie had her nipples tingling. Or maybe that was the kiss, and the way his hands seemed to be all over her. Pressed against him like this, she could feel a hardness against her belly, which she didn't think was his belt buckle. And the knowledge he wanted her as much as she wanted him had her squirming desperately against his warmth. And then they were on the bed, and his hands really were everywhere. When he squeezed one of her plump breasts, they both let out moans of pleasure, which had her arching against his touch. The silk slithered between them, sensual and erotic and strange all at once, and only heightened her pleasure. His lips were on her neck, then her shoulder, then lower, closing over one nipple through the silk, as his wonderfully rough hands inched the hem of the nightie upward. As his tongue caused her to gasp, he slid one finger inside her, and his groan made her feel as powerful as his touch did. He pulled away, but only long enough to yank at his jeans and boxers, finally, and she used the break to breathlessly tug her own nightgown off. He joined her on the bed once more, stretching his long legs beside hers, and when he pressed against her, she could feel how ready he was to make love to her. "Seems a shame to waste such a nice nightie," he murmured against the skin of her neck. She could barely concentrate on his words. I'll wear it again Samedi, oh." And then he was rolling atop her, guiding himself to her entrance, and she was ready for him. There was some pain at first, but when he reached between their bodies and continued to stroke, she relaxed under him, opening herself to his gentle touch. His thumb found the center of her pleasure, but it was the way he was looking at her, reverently, as if she were the most incredible woman in the world, which made her breathless in anticipation. He worked himself in her, whispering half-formed endearments, until his eyes squeezed shut and he whispered her name harshly. She found her pleasure at the same moment, her legs instinctively tightening around him, pulling him even deeper, closer. Once they'd both reached the end of their climatic roller coaster, he collapsed beside her, spent, and pulled her into his arms. They were completely nude, sprawled atop the blankets, breathing heavily, but Jami didn't feel chilly at all. No. Instead, she felt protected. Under her cheek, his heartbeat was slowing, and his breathing was evening out. She wondered if hers was as well. Cautiously, she spread her palm against his taut stomach and felt his fingers idly caressing her back. Her husband. She'd married him for the sake of convenience, because he was a good man, and so she could actually experience everything she'd researched for so long. But lying there in his arms on their wedding night, feeling cherished and beautiful, Jami had a worrying realization: she could very easily fall in love with this man. And wouldn't that be inconvenient? Chapter 6. Being married was nice. Well, to be fair, she'd only been married 2 days, but those 2 days were very nice. She and Cade had spent all of Saturday just laying around the hotel room, feeding each other room service, and learning about one another's bodies. Who knew there were so many ways to make love? Just thinking about the things she'd learned, and the experiences they'd shared, made Jami blush. Oh, there she goes again. She jerked her head up from where she'd been contemplating her mostly empty plate, to find Jim Cauldron smiling at her. "What?" she asked, pretending confusion. Jim elbowed Wyatt, who was sitting beside him at the family dinner. "Anytime someone's not actively speaking to her, your brother's wife goes all starry-eyed and starts blushing." Solemnly, Wyatt nodded. Either Griselda's chicken and dumplings are giving her indigestion, or Cade has given her lots to think about. Beside her, Cade reached out and took her hand. When he squeezed it, she peeked up at him, and he winked. That made her blush harder, she was certain. My dinner does not give out indigestion, the Cauldron family housekeeper called from her place at the other end of the table. And to insinuate that is just plain. All right, boys, lay off, their grandfather interrupted. Griselda, your cooking is fine. Fine, she repeated, with narrowed eyes. The corners of Pop's lips tugged upward in a way which reminded Jami of her new husband. Yep. Perfectly adequate. It was obvious he was teasing her. It's delicious, as always, Griselda, Decker corrected, and the woman huffed. Point is, Pops continued, you boys need to be polite to Jami. She's a cauldron now, and that makes Cade my favorite, until one of you get around to marrying. Wyatt blinked innocently, while Jim bent back over the last of his chicken and began scooping the gravy onto a spoon. Thought Bob was your favorite, seeing as how he beat Cade to the altar by a whopping 6 days. His grandfather shrugged. Bob and Tessa ain't here, are they? So Cade's my favorite for now. When those two lovebirds get back, they can both be my favorites, yeah? From his spot beside the old man, Ted shook his head. I can't believe both of you are married. He nodded to Jami. But it sure is nice to have some fresh blood around for these Sunday evening dinners. Looking forward to hearing all about your work sometime. Jami smiled and nodded in agreement. She imagined, after a while, Sunday dinners must start to blend together, with everyone always talking about the same things. If the rest of the Cauldrons began marrying, all their new wives would have even more to discuss. The thought of 5 other women gathered around the table made her cock her head thoughtfully. What kind of brides would the other Cauldron men choose? She'd made an extensive study on marriages of convenience, and while she knew it worked out in most cases, as long as the couple were willing to work to make it work, it was hard to imagine all 6 of the new Cauldron marriages. Wait, it was only 5, wasn't it? With a wry grin, she eyed Wyatt and remembered Cade's story about how that brother in particular refused to marry. And just because the others had agreed to marry, it didn't mean they'd go the route of a marriage of convenience, the way she and Cade, and Bob and Tessa, had done. Maybe they'd go about marriage in a perfectly normal way. Well. Griselda's strident tone interrupted her musings, as the older woman began to collect plates. I, for one, am looking forward to having some more feminine blood in this house. Yeah, Pop's gaze turned wistful. Me too. Jami stood up to help clear the table, but Griselda waved her back down. It's Cade and Wyatt's turn to help clean, dear. You go with the others into the family room, and we'll have your dessert right out. Well, how could she argue when there was dessert on the line? She turned to Cade and saw his eyes twinkling as he smiled at her. I believe it's chocolate, he whispered. She pushed herself closer, to whisper to him, she told herself, not to get another whiff of his delicious scent. Probably. Okay, she was sniffing him, but how could she not, when the scent reminded her of all the glorious ways he made her feel? What kind of chocolate, she breathed. He winked, and she swore she could feel something explode in her stomach and send lightning bolts up into her chest area. It wasn't her heart though. Definitely not. Does it matter? Chocolate is chocolate, he called, as he pushed away from the table and began to collect silverware. Well, he was right about that. And as Jami, grinning, followed the rest of the Cauldrons into the spacious family room, with the wooden beams in the walls which made it look like it might be the original ranch house, she reflected that it was nice to start out her marriage with something in common with her husband. Chocolate and really great sex. What else does a marriage need? Snorting quietly to herself, she settled at one end of a couch. There were 2 in the room, facing one another, and 4 comfy-looking chairs. It was obvious this room had been well used for many years, but it still looked warm and welcoming. It'd be nice to grow old in a place like this, surrounded by family and friends. She and Cade hadn't discussed living arrangements yet, but when they'd checked out of the hotel and returned home, they'd caught Deck coming down the stairs with 2 loaded duffel bags. He'd grinned knowingly and nodded politely to her, then explained he was moving into the big house, the one they were in now, for a while, with Pops and Ted and Griselda. Well, Cade hadn't liked that idea, claiming he didn't want to kick his brother out of his home. But Jami hadn't minded having some more privacy in the beginning of her new marriage, so she'd kept her mouth shut and shot her new brother-in-law a grateful look. Decker had ultimately won the argument by reassuring his brother it wouldn't be forever, and it'd make him feel more comfortable at this time. Cade had huffed, but after Deck left, Jami had pointed out this meant they had the entire house to do whatever they wanted, and that cheered him up a bit. Then he introduced her to the fun to be had in the shower of the master bathroom, and they both plumb forgot about Deck. Yep. Chocolate and really great sex. As the others slowly filed into the room, Jami realized she was staring out the window at the darkening eastern sky. She knew marriage was supposed to be based on more than that, although chocolate and sex was important, but what she and Cade had was a modern marriage of convenience, which meant she was lucky to have anything in common with her husband. And the problem with her current situation, which she'd realized over the last 2 days, was it would be very easy to want more from this marriage. More than chocolate and great sex even. But Cade, her husband, hadn't agreed to anything more. He'd made it clear this was just a convenient solution to get what they both wanted, nothing more, and she'd be foolish to allow herself to hope for more, if her husband had no desire to want the same. Something particularly interesting out there? Pops grunted the question, as he settled himself into one of the chairs by the empty fireplace. Jami shook herself and faced the old man with a smile, having realized the other Cauldron men had joined them in the room. Nope, just thinking. Pops hummed thoughtfully and dropped one hand over the side of the chair arm. Those big windows are good for that. Even better is heading out back to sit on the porch when the sun is setting. You can see most of Montana, seems like. Ted chuckled. It's really a fantastic view. I can see why our great whatever grandparents built their house here. Deck settled himself against the mantel, arms folded across his wide chest. I'm partial to the view from up on the ridge myself. If I ever get a hankering to build my own house, that's where it's going. He shot Jami a look, and she knew he was thinking about how he'd moved out that afternoon. She felt a stab of guilt at the knowledge she'd pushed him from his home, but he seemed easygoing about a lot of things in life. Pops hummed in agreement. That's a fine piece of land up there, provided you're not trying to grow anything. You could put your house up there, raise a whole passel of young uns, and still come down to the ranch for work. Yes sir, I could, was all Deck replied, but judging from Jim's grin, there was more to that conversation Jami wasn't privy to. That was the moment a snuffling sound from the door had Jami twisting in her seat. And watched in shock as a pig walked in. A pig. A pig walked into the room. It was a huge thing, standing like 3 feet tall, and big and round. Its nose was pointed at the ground and its feet seemed much too tiny to support something so rotund. Jami was pretty sure she made a little squeaking noise. It's about time you joined us, Herman, Pop scolded, and snapped his fingers. The pig, this pig had a name, snuffled its way over to the chair where Pops had draped his arm and pushed its nose under the old man's hand. And Pop started scratching the thing behind its ears. You've shocked Jami, Pops, Ted said blandly. Every man in the room turned to look at her, and Jim began to chuckle. Pops was smiling. I guess I did, huh? He tugged on one of the animal's ears. Herman, this is Jami. She's part of the family now. Go say hello. With a little grunt, how in the world could such a big animal make such a cute little noise? The pig picked up his head and trotted over to the couch, and she had no choice but to lift her hand and place it on its head. It was looking up at her with the cutest little black, beady eyes, and shifted its head so her hand was behind its ear. Jami, this is Herman. Folks around these parts call him my familiar, but I just think he's one smart pig. Hi, Herman, she managed in a small voice. And the pig, Herman, bobbed his head at her. Now that they'd been properly introduced, she was going to have to start referring to him as a him, she supposed. You're familiar? She asked, as Herman shifted his head so she could reach a different spot with her scratching. Jim was smiling, of course. Seemed like that man was always smiling. Surely you've noticed folks around here treat us a bit oddly? The whole licking the fingers thing? Yep. We noticed you had some fun with Pastor Dinkelheimler on Friday. When she opened her mouth to apologize, Jim continued, and we all agreed the man deserved it. They all got it into their heads there was something unlucky about triplets. Yeah, but even before then, there were rumors about the Cauldrons and the ranch, Deck drawled from his place at Pop's shoulder. About how we're wizards or something. Ted lifted his brows. Our name is Cauldron, and we do have unusually good luck. Luck? Pop snorted. You boys work hard at your chosen professions. That's not luck, it's hard work's reward. Deck shrugged. But that's why Herman is sometimes called Pop's familiar. I gotta say, I've never met a pig as smart as that animal. Under her hand, Herman bobbed his head, as if agreeing. She met his little beady eyes. You seem pretty smart, Herman. What's 1 + 1? And the pig grunted twice. Oh. She was about to quiz him some more, when Cade stepped into the room, carrying 2 bowls with a spoon sticking out of each of them. Griselda made chocolate mousse for dessert. He handed one to Pops, then crossed to Jami's side. And I know you want some. While Herman grunted hopefully at the bowl, she grimaced down at her hand. Maybe I should go wash up. Nah, Cade drawled, Herman's an indoor pig, and Griselda keeps him clean as clean can be. But I've got some hand sanitizer around here somewhere. You can't just give that away, willy-nilly, Jim called out, that's liquid gold. As the others chuckled, Jami made quick work of rubbing her hands clean, and reaching for the bowl of mousse. Cade straightened and looked around. I'm assuming Ted doesn't want any, the man doesn't like mousse, which is a sin, as far as I'm concerned, but everyone else wants a bowl, right? Jim nodded, but Deck waved his hand. None for me, thanks. Shrugging, Cade headed back toward the kitchen. Fine by me. More for me and Jami, he called with a wink over his shoulder. And the warm feeling which spread through her had nothing to do with the delicious taste of the mousse exploding on her tongue, and everything to do with the way her husband made her feel. Jim chuckled. I swear, that guy hasn't had it this bad since Bianca. Ted was nodding as he leaned forward to snap his fingers to call Herman. Leave Jami alone to eat, Herman. Come here. Yeah, he said to Jim, Cade seems real happy with Jami. There was a lump in her throat, and she wasn't sure why. Placing the spoon back in the bowl, Jami told herself that of course Cade seemed happy, he'd gotten his marriage of convenience, just like he'd wanted. But Pops took a break from shoveling his mousse into his mouth, to look up. He didn't marry Bianca, did he? Nope, and he certainly won't find any better than who he has now. Marry Bianca? Hasn't had it this bad since Bianca. Wait, was Bianca an ex-girlfriend? Who's Bianca? She'd tried for a nonchalant tone, but thought she might have failed when Ted winced. Jim just leaned back against the couch and threw his arm over the back. She's the woman we all thought Cade was gonna marry, 2 years ago now. She was pretty and sweet, up until she got what she wanted anyway. And what was that? Jami made herself ask. But the guilty look on Jim's face told her he'd suddenly decided he'd said too much. And he was likely saved by Cade's return, bearing 2 more bowls, one for him and one for Jim, and followed by Wyatt and a complaining Griselda. As they settled into the family room, Jami tried not to feel cheated by not knowing more about Bianca. You only knew the man for a few days before you got married. Of course he didn't tell you everything about his past. And it's not like he married you for love or anything. Not like what he must have had with Bianca. Cade sat beside her on the couch, and she tried to relax against him, to enjoy the dessert. But a big part of her was thinking about Bianca, and the fact he must have loved her, if his family thought he was going to marry her. And the chocolate didn't taste quite so yummy anymore. Chapter 7. Well, Cade had to admit being married wasn't half bad. It was Tuesday, which meant he had all of 4 days' experience, but he had to admit those 4 days had him walking on clouds. It was nice to come home and make dinner every night, with Jami by his side, instead of switching off responsibilities. It was nice to chat with her about their projects and plans and possibilities for the future. And it sure was nice when the two of them cuddled up together on the couch to watch one of those new superhero movies, because it always seemed to lead to her sitting on his lap, and kissing, and the bowl of popcorn flying across the room. Yeah, being married was fun. It was just too bad it wasn't for the right reasons. With a sigh, Cade put the bag of protein supplements back on the counter and rolled his neck, hoping to ease the kinks out of it. He'd been working all afternoon on a new blend for Moonbeam, because he was concerned about the amount of protein she was and wasn't getting. Carrying twin foals was always dangerous, and he couldn't afford her nutrition to lag. It could result in early labor or unhealthy foals. Jim would never forgive Cade if that happened, he was certain, so he forced himself to focus on what he was doing, instead of Jami. Jami, who even now was waiting for him at home, working on her book in her robe and those fuzzy socks he thought were so cute. Jami, who would welcome him with a smile and a kiss, which made him feel like focus. Right. As he reached for the measuring scoop and the kitchen scale he used for small batches, he heard a noise on the other side of his office door. It was normally open in the warmth of the summer, and today was no different. He looked up, hoping maybe Jami had come to visit, even though he was supposed to be focusing, and darn near swallowed his tongue when another woman stepped into his office. Bianca Di Sarno was just as beautiful as she'd been when she'd broken his heart 2 years ago. She was tall and slender, her slick dark hair falling in a perfectly straight, shimmering waterfall down her back. As always, she was dressed to the nines in a light green tailored jacket and skirt, and heels, which were far too impractical for a Montana ranch. He'd always wondered how she'd managed to get around all the piles of horse manure around here. Of course, now that she was working for a big company, she probably fit right in. "Hello, Cade," she said in that sultry voice, which always made his knees weak. Except, today it didn't. And she was beautiful, yeah, but he wasn't quite as captivated as he'd been when they'd been together. All he could think of when he looked at her was how silly she looked, dressed all fancy someplace like Cauldron Valley Ranch. Jami, on the other hand, always looked right at home. So he just nodded politely. "Bianca," he acknowledged, and was pleased he didn't feel any anger or longing or anything. She must have taken that as an invitation, because she sauntered farther into the office, coming to a stop on the other side of the table he used for his concoctions. With a playful smile, she swept one lacquered fingertip along the top edge of a set of pipettes. "Still hard at work, I see," she teased. "You really are one of the top minds in this business, aren't you?" "Ah. Yeah." He raised a brow in challenge. "I am." When he'd first met Bianca, he'd just thought she was a pretty girl who was interested in his work. After a lifetime of stupid superstitions from the townsfolk, it was nice to meet someone who didn't lick her fingers and stick them in the air whenever he walked by, so Cade had asked her out. As they dated, he started bringing her to the ranch. She was so interested in his work, always asking questions, he took that to mean she was falling in love with him. So he was happy to tell her and show her more and more, even showing her all the behind-the-scenes stuff at magic meals. He shouldn't have. Because 2 years ago, she broke his heart when she left him, and Cauldron Valley, behind. Dimly, Cade became aware she was speaking, and he forced himself to let go of his bitterness and focus. Bianca was going on about life in the big city, and how quaint Cauldron Valley seemed now, and how good it was to see him and be back on the ranch, and... "What are you doing here, Bianca?" Her smile turned sensual, and she touched her lower lip with her fingertip, the way she's always done to draw attention to herself. "Do I need a reason to call on an old friend?" Jami never needed artifice like that to hold his attention. What did that say about her? Cade snorted softly and began to move his ingredients into order for his experiment. He wanted to try some different mixes, but he darn well wasn't going to do it with her around. "Protein powders, She leaned forward, reading the names off the bags, even though they'd be upside down to her. "Does this have anything to do with that pregnant mare I've been hearing about in town?" "Twins?" She'd heard about Moonbeam? Cade's gaze snapped up to hers, and in the moment before she blinked and hid her true feelings behind a mask of innocence, he saw cold calculation in her eyes. "All of our pregnant maras are important," he said carefully, not sure how much he could reveal to her now that she was well, it didn't matter. Best to keep his mouth shut and stay as vague as possible. She hummed thoughtfully, her eyes darting around the ingredients. You know, with as rare as twin foals are, there's a lot of talk about how it's the magic of this place at work again. This time her smile seemed more sly than sensual when she turned it on him. But I think it's a result of your brilliant nutrition. He wasn't so sure that what Moonbeam ate could result in twins. Seemed more likely that had to do with her or the sire's bloodlines, which was Bob's area, or even Jim's careful breeding. Or just plain luck. Or magic. But either way, it probably wasn't a result of Cade's work. So he shrugged. I'm just in charge of keeping them healthy. Not liking the way she was eyeing his workspace, he began to close everything up. Why are you here? This time she didn't pretend. Shrugging, she said, there are some people I work with who are very interested in your recipe for your pregnant mares. We'd be willing to pay you a lot of money for your proprietary blend of. Nope. That was an easy answer. Not interested. Coming around the edge of the table, he took her arm and turned her around. Even though she smiled at him and tried to lean into his touch, he was thrilled to discover he felt nothing at all. She was too tall. Too skinny. Too fancy. Too not Jami. At the door, he set Bianca away from him and offered a tight smile. You tell your bosses I will never sell to them. Not this formula or any other one. I think they've got enough of my ideas, don't you? He didn't give her time to answer, but shut the door in her surprised-looking face. Then, blowing out a breath, he turned back to his workbench and ran his fingers through his hair. I'm not going to get any more work done today, am I? Cade occupied himself with cleaning up everything, knowing he was likely done with work. Also, it gave Bianca time to head out. He wasn't certain he could stand to see her again. After about 30 minutes, he cautiously stuck his head out, knowing he looked like a coward, and hoping no one was out there. Luckily, no one was. But out in the corral, Jim was working with Moonbeam. When Cade saw the pair, he headed in that direction. Propping his booted foot up on the lowest rail, he watched the way his cousin spoke soothingly to the ponderous mare. From this distance, he couldn't hear what Jim was saying, but it was clear from the way the animal moved that the other man was calling directions. After a minute, Jim noticed his presence, and motioned to Moonbeam. Obediently, the horse bobbed her head, as if she understood, and followed Jim as he headed toward Cade. Reaching them, Moonbeam stuck her head near Cade's shoulder, so he obligingly rubbed her nose, then her neck. He was just about to start some small talk about the horse, something he figured he could handle right then, when Jim spoke. Boy, you look rotten, his cousin drawled. Cade kept his mouth shut, not sure if he should tell the other man about Bianca's visit or not. Jim's command of the stables and the men who worked in them was undisputed. He might be pretty irritated to find out she'd been poking around. On the other hand, maybe he knew. You haven't seen anyone around? Anyone? Jim frowned as he pushed his hat up higher on his forehead. Are you new here? We've got about a dozen men working today. Cade winced, realizing how stupid that had sounded. I meant, never mind, doesn't matter. His cousin stared at him for a moment too long, then clucked his tongue, which had Moonbeam swinging her head toward him. This is about Jami, isn't it? Cade reared back, dropping his arms away from the upper rail. Huh? He'd been thinking about Bianca. Hadn't he? But his cousin just shook his head and headed toward the gate. Without being prompted, the mare followed, and Cade found himself following along on the outside of the fence. It's easy to tell, Jim called out with a smile. You look like one of my mares does when the stallion bites her on the butt. Irritated but intrigued, and horny as all get out. Well, that was a fairly offensive description. As his cousin led Moonbeam out of the corral, Cade asked indignantly, Did you just compare me to a horse? Jim shot him a huge grin. So why the long face? When Cade groaned at the stupid joke, Jim cracked up, pulling off his hat and slapping it against his thigh as he headed toward the stables. Shaking his head, Cade followed. This particular cousin of his was a real jokester, and his brothers and cousins had learned young to always check their milk for pepper he might have poured, or their boots for critters he might have hidden inside. But Jim could always be counted on for a good laugh, as long as it wasn't a dumb joke like that had been. To be fair, I did walk right into it. So, Jim called over Moonbeam's back as they entered the cooler darkness of the stables, "What's the deal? What's wrong?" Cade opened his mouth to tell him nothing was wrong, but closed it again and cocked his head thoughtfully. Up until that moment, he hadn't realized something was wrong. But now that Jim had asked, "Are you not enjoying being married?" From the way his cousin was watching him, it was clear Jim already knew the answer, but Cade snorted anyhow as he crossed his arms and leaned against a post. "I like it fine. A little too fine. Jami's great. I like being around her, and I'm excited about the idea of spending the rest of my life with her." Jim had already started brushing down the mare, murmuring words of praise to her. When it was clear Cade was finished, he shot his cousin a look. "So, what's wrong? You said a little too fine." Shrugging, Cade watched the other man work, a worried frown tugging at his brow. "She married me because of her book," he finally confessed in a low voice. "We both went into this marriage knowing it was just a marriage of convenience. We both needed a spouse, me for the ranch and Pops, her as research for her next book, and that's all this was going to mean." "Ah." Jim was quite a few minutes, moving to Moonbeam's other side, before he spoke again. "And now it means more, huh?" "To me," Cade burst out. "I think it's starting to mean more to me, and that's—" He clamped his lips shut, but Jim slowly straightened, brush in hand. He met Cade's eyes, and for a man who was normally so jovial, the serious look on his face was unusual. "That's what, Cade?" he asked in a low voice. Cade looked away. "It's scary, all right? I'm not going to fall in love with a woman who only married me for convenience's sake." Silence stretched between them, before Jim finally grunted and turned away, tossing the brush aside and murmuring something to Moonbeam. The mare obediently followed him to her stall, where Cade's proprietary blend of supplements awaited her. "Tell her how you feel," Jim's command drifted out of the stall. Not sure if his cousin was talking to him or to the mare, Cade muttered, "I'm not sure how I feel," although he suspected that was a lie. After a moment, Jim stepped back out of the stall, a grin on his face. "Then buy her something nice. Women always like gifts, yeah? Use that as an excuse to talk about your feelings." "Or her feelings." He shrugged. "Whatever. Point is, something sparkly and meaningful is always nice." "Are you just saying that because you want something sparkly and meaningful?" Cade asked with a frown. "Yeah," Jim called with a bigger smile as he headed for the main doors, "and you never get me anything." He walked out, then stuck his head back around the door. "Remember, diamonds are a girl's best friend." Cade let out an obligatory snort at that stupid joke, but the idea of giving something to Jami had him dropping his head back against the post and staring up at the rafters. Sparkly and meaningful. Meaningful. Maybe not diamonds, but his mind jumped to the little vial of gold they'd panned for last week. It had been their first date together, and their first kiss. Jami wasn't like Bianca, he knew that instinctively. She wasn't too fancy or fake. She didn't need diamonds. But he hadn't had a ring for her at the wedding ceremony. It wasn't something they'd talked about, but neither of them had had the time, apparently. Pastor Dinkelheimler had skipped over the ring part when he learned they hadn't purchased any yet. Oh, Cade had promised he would get some, and would get them blessed and everything, but Jami had just shrugged and said she didn't wear rings while she was typing. So they'd left it at that. But now he was thinking about that gold, and what he could do with it. Sparkly and meaningful. Something to show Jami what she meant to him. And then, maybe, he could figure out how to get her to tell him what he meant to her. Because if the answer was nothing more than a convenient husband, he needed to know that sooner rather than later. Before he went and fell in love with his wife. Chapter 8. Are you getting hungry? Jami smiled when Cade's head jerked up from his computer, obviously startled by her sudden appearance. Well, it hadn't been that sudden. She'd stood in the door of his office for almost a minute, waiting for him to notice her. He'd obviously been engrossed in his work. "Hi," he said, a grin easing the lines of his forehead. "You want to go out for lunch?" "Even better." She waggled the cooler in her grip. "I brought a picnic for both of us." This time his smile was so big the little lines around his eyes crinkled. "That sounds awesome. Let me get the key for the golf cart, and we can head up to the overlook." It was exactly what Jami had had in mind when she'd packed today, so she only nodded and headed out of the office while he cleaned up. She'd spent the morning wrestling with her notes and theories for the rest of her book, but finally gave up and went for a walk. The walk hadn't helped, but gave her the picnic idea. It had been almost 2 weeks since her wedding to Cade. 2 weeks of marriage, and a lifetime to go. Over the years, she'd interviewed so many brides, recent and long-married ones, who spoke of their marriages and experiences. The one thing all who married quickly agreed on was there was a moment where they had to make the conscious choice to make this marriage work. A marriage of convenience only worked if both partners were committed to the idea of marriage, if both husband and wife had the same expectations. And the problem was, the longer she was married to Cade, the more she suspected they wanted different things. He wanted a wife, while she wanted a partner. She wanted him to love her, because she was certain she'd fallen in love with him. And why not? He was handsome, yeah, but more than that, he was kind and thoughtful, and the way he worried over everything just showed how much he cared. Oh, and he was smart too, which made him a wonderful conversationalist. "So what's going on with the book?" he asked, booted feet up on the dashboard of the golf cart, only a few minutes later, as he munched on the ham and cheese sandwich she'd made him. Words not flowing today? They'd chatted about her work over the last 2 weeks, but Jami wondered if this was her chance to lay it all out for him. "I'm at an impasse, I think," she began cautiously. When he hummed, she continued. "I'm almost caught up, real life, I mean. My experiences. I could end the book here." She pretended great interest in the bag of chips in her hand. "I'd always intended for the last chapter to be personal, you know." "Yeah." From the corner of her eye, she saw him gesture with his sandwich. "And, having read your most recent one, I think it's a great idea. Sort of tie it together with the other personal experiences you've recorded, and set the stage for the next book." "Wait, you read my last book?" When he realized she was peering at him suspiciously, he flushed and shrugged. "Sure. I mean, in ebook on my phone. I hope it's okay, I didn't buy the hardback. I like the fact I can get an instant download." She didn't care how he read it. "You actually bought my book and read it?" Again, he shrugged, turning a bit on the seat to face her. "Is that okay? I didn't think to ask you, but we've talked about your work enough that I thought you wouldn't mind." Her mouth opened and closed a few times, because she couldn't come up with what she wanted to say. Here she was, struggling with her feelings for him already, and he went and did something so sweet and meaningful. "Jami? I'm sorry. I didn't think it was that big a deal." Finally, she shook the daze from her brain. No. No, it's not. I mean, that's amazing. Thank you." She met his worried eyes. "Thank you for taking the time to read it. That means a lot to me." His slight smile looked hesitant. "Usually just on my lunch breaks, but I'll admit that the chapters on the Guild of Godmothers had me sitting at my desk most of the afternoon, reading instead of working. They're fascinating." "Yeah, they really are." She blew out a breath. "Wow, okay. So now you know exactly what I'm struggling with." "Not really, no." He took another bite, and around it, said, "Sounds like you're done with the book." She shrugged. "More or less. I mean, not writing at all, but I've got the basic structure and notes to finish it off." "So what's the problem?" She met his lovely eyes, then looked away, over the landscape. Gosh, Montana was beautiful. And she was going to get to live here for the rest of her life. But would she be happy? Only if she could make herself content with what she had, instead of always wishing for what could never be. She inhaled. I need to set the next book up. About marriages of convenience? That's why you married me, after all. Research. Did he sound a little bitter? It was hard to tell. Jami hitched one shoulder in a half shrug. I always intended the next book to be about the state of marriage, the give and take. More psychology and less anthropology. I just need to figure out the angle before I finish this one, so I can set it all up. Would her next book be about marriages of convenience building into mutual love and joy, or about learning to make the best of what your spouse was willing to give? The two options would result in very different books, and as much as she wanted to write the former, she was afraid her personal experience was going to be the latter. Cade finished his sandwich while she was musing, and now balled up the baggie to jam it back in the cooler. As he drained the last of his soda, it was apparent he was ready to be done with lunch. Well, I know you'll figure it out. I'm happy to help, if I can. Or you can bounce ideas off me. Rolling up the top of her half-eaten chips, Jami realized she'd barely touched her food. That wasn't like her at all, but her worries had her stomach tied up in knots. Hopefully, Cade wouldn't notice. Thanks, she said in a quiet voice, as she packed up her uneaten lunch. I think I just need to ponder it a bit more. Did you take that walk up to the ridge I suggested? He put the cart in reverse, turning around in his seat to back away from the overlook. She smiled a bit. Yeah, and I saw the spot Deck wants to build his house someday. He already has it staked out. Chuckling, he nodded. I helped him do that when we were 16. The man has plans. Remembering how good it felt to walk freely and fill her lungs with the sweet mountain air, Jami's spirits rose a bit. Maybe she would be able to work through this. I think, when we get back to the stable, I'll go for another walk. Can I leave the cooler with you? Cade slowed the cart long enough to lean over and give her a quick kiss on the cheek. You betcha, sweetheart. And the moment felt so perfect, Jami wondered if maybe she could write the book she wanted, after all. Unfortunately, Jami's problems didn't magically go away just from a nice walk, but she did get distracted. A lot. Which was nice. There were fluffy white clouds and friendly waves, and she even stopped to watch Jim and some of his men working some of the young foals, which was just adorable. And when it was time to head back home, her feet were tired. Jami found herself walking past Bob and Tessa's house. The couple had arrived home from Yellowstone the same night Jami had joined the Cauldrons for Sunday dinner, but she hadn't seen them until later that week. From what she gathered, Bob and Tessa had had some trouble in their relationship at the beginning, but as of last week, things appeared to have cleared up. In fact, Tessa was sitting on the front porch, a lemonade in hand, talking at her laptop. When she saw Jami, she stood and waved. Jami. Come say hi to Joy. Confused, there wasn't anyone else around. Jami did as she was told, and jogged up the front walk, then the porch steps. Smiling, Tessa turned the laptop around. Remember Joy? Joy, you remember Jami, right? She was Dr. Lachille's assistant? Well, she's the one who stuck around the ranch. On the screen, the pretty face of Tessa's best friend burst into a smile. Oh, yes, she gasped happily. You're the one who married Bob's cousin, right? Gage? Cage? Smiling, Jami sank down on the porch swing when Tessa gestured. Cade, she corrected, and yes. We were married right before Tessa and Bob got back from Yellowstone. Okay, I want to hear all about it. Joy demanded. Tessa, who hadn't sat back down, waved her fingers happily. Yes, chit-chat. I'm going to go get Jami some lemonade. Be right back. On the computer screen, Joy leaned forward. I notice you didn't offer me any. Tessa called over her shoulder, and it's the really good homemade stuff, too. Tease, Joy grumbled, sitting back, a smirk tugging at her lips as she focused on Jami once more. She knows how much I like homemade lemonade. Jami cocked her head, confused by the friend's interaction. But aren't you back home in Illinois, right? As she understood it, Tessa's bestie had flown back home right after the wedding, and planned to drive all of Tessa's stuff out next week. The other woman waved dismissively. She could have offered at least. From inside the house, Tessa called out, "No, I couldn't." And Jami pressed her lips together to hide her grin. With a huff, Joy moved her camera a little farther away, looked like she was in her bedroom or something, and pulled her legs up to sit cross-legged on her chair. "Okay, so tell me all about Cade and how you two ended up married and the wedding and everything." So she did. Jami left out a lot of the details, especially the private details, but loved how sweet and open Joy was about everything. She really was named aptly. Joy was a joy to be around. By the time Tessa returned with a tall glass of fresh, homemade lemonade, Jami felt like she'd known Joy for years, so she didn't see any trouble with taking a long sip of the lemonade, looking Joy straight in the eyes, and teasing, "This is delicious. So sweet and tart and refreshing." Yeah, I get it," sighed Joy, reaching for her water bottle. "I swear, when I get out there next week, you're both going to owe me some lemonade." Tessa leaned into the shot. "You're dragging all my stuff out here." "I think I can make you some lemonade." Jami grinned. "If you'll stop by Charlotte on your way to pick up some of my stuff, I'll make you lemonade too." "You want me to stop by North Carolina on my way from Illinois to Montana?" Joy asked with a frown. Shrugging, Jami hid her grin behind her glass. "Why not? Not like there's a travel ban in effect or something." When Joy blew a raspberry, Jami giggled, and it felt good to be among friends. "So, what did I miss?" Tessa asked as she settled back against the swing with Jami, the laptop now propped on the table in front of him. Jami was telling me all about her marriage, and why she got married, and her book and everything. Joy wriggled her fingers dismissively. "Since I'm sure you know all of that already, let's skip to the interesting questions." Jami raised her brows. "Questions? What's wrong?" Joy leaned forward, the empathy in her eyes apparent. "You got married basically for research, right? But you've admitted you like Cade, and liked him even before you said yes to him. You definitely like his kisses. So." Blushing, Jami leaned forward to place her glass on the table beside the laptop. "She's right." Tessa elbowed Jami. "I didn't notice it before, but something's definitely not right." "Do you not like him anymore?" "Bob was a real pill for those first few weeks, claiming stupid stuff like he didn't want me to work and thought I should cook and clean. There was a time I wasn't sure how we were supposed to stay married. Without me bashing him in the head with a frying pan, that is." She smiled. "But he had a major turnaround. Want me to get him to have a chat with Cade?" No, Jami hurried to assure her new friends. "No, Cade's awesome," she sighed. "Uh-huh." Joy nodded. "A little too awesome, huh? How'd she know? Is it that obvious?" Jami groaned, dropped her head to her hands. "Yes, he's sweet and kind and OMG, I think I'm falling in love with him." She felt Tessa's hand drop to her back, rubbing small circles comfortingly. "I hate to tell you this, hon," she said softly, "but I think you're already in love with him." Jami groaned again, because she knew the other woman was right. When Joy spoke, she addressed Tessa. "I only met Cade briefly, but he seemed nice. Is there any reason Jami shouldn't fall in love with him? He is her husband, after all." Jami straightened, dropping her hands. "No," she sighed, answering for Tessa. "He's wonderful, but he married me for convenience's sake." She bit her lip. Cade had been in love once, his family all said he was set to marry that Bianca chick. So he obviously believed in marriage for love, just not with someone like Jami Boatright. Sighing, she shook her head. "That's why we married. That was the deal. I can't fall in love with him if he's just going to think of me as a means to an end, you know? He just needed a wife, and I was handy." "Are you sure?" Joy asked quietly. Jami bit her lip. Because no, she wasn't sure. Tessa slung her arm around Jami's shoulders. "Listen, hon, here's what I think. Cade is a good guy. I haven't been here long, but Bob always speaks well of him, and I trust Bob's judgment. Now that he's got his head out of his butt, I mean." Jami's lips twitched. My point is, Tessa gave her a little shake, that there's no reason to think Cade couldn't be falling in love with you. Jami's head whipped around. Wait, what? Tessa shrugged. Sure. On the screen, Joy leaned forward. You said he's sweet and kind and blah blah blah. Well, so are you, Jami. How do you know he hasn't already fallen in love with you? He could be, right now, struggling with the same level of doubt and uncertainty you are. Jami's eyes had gone wide. Because he loves me? Joy shrugged. I don't know. But it's a possibility, isn't it? Her next book could go one of two ways, and Jami knew which way she wanted it to go. She wanted to write about how her marriage of convenience had turned into something equitable and wonderful. But Cade had made it clear what he wanted from this marriage. She bit her lip. I don't know. Listen, all we're saying is it's a possibility, yeah? Tessa gave her one more squeeze, before dropping her arm. You don't have to jump on him and pin him down or anything. Unless you two are into that sort of thing. Joy broke in with a giggle. Unless you two are into that sort of thing and it's mutual, Tessa went on as if the interruption hadn't happened. But we're just saying you need to think about it. Maybe his feelings haven't changed. But maybe they have. Jami tried to ignore the fierce hope her friend's words caused to bloom in her chest. She tried to tell herself it was false hope, so she wouldn't be crushed. But there was a possibility, wasn't there? She might actually be able to love her husband, and have him love her in return. Oh, look at that smile, Tessa. Joy squealed from the laptop screen. Yay. Tessa giggled, picking up her lemonade. Now, let's talk about something else. Okay. Did I tell you about the mess Keith made at the last staff meeting? And as the two friends picked up their threads of gossip once more, Jami sat, nursing her lemonade, and considering the possibilities, and her heart felt as if it were skipping happily. Chapter 9. You're in a good mood, Jim said as he stuck his head into Cade's office, a smirk on his face. Cade's head jerked up from the calculations he was doing. Huh? His cousin's grin grew. You were whistling. Could hear it way out here. I take it you had a good weekend? You and the missus couldn't keep your hands off one another at last night's family dinner. Straightening, Cade let his lips curl into an easy, satisfied smile. Yeah, he drawled. We had a great weekend. And it wasn't all great sex, although that sure didn't hurt. He and Jami were amazing together, in bed and out of it. Yeah, she was hot in that little silk nightie she'd gotten for their wedding night, sure. But she was just as tempting when she wrapped herself up in his blue robe after a shower. They'd already made plans to fly down to Charlotte next month and drive back with her stuff, visiting her family on the way. She insisted she had her own robe she could wear after that, but truthfully, he really liked the way she looked in his robe. And in his shirts. And in his bed, and the number of times he'd pulled that robe off her, sometimes with his teeth, because he couldn't wait to get her into said bed. Cade's smile grew as he shook his head. Yeah, this whole marriage thing was working out okay. His cousin snorted slightly and shook his head. Okay, whatever caused that satisfied look, you don't need to tell me about it. Hey, I like being married. Obviously. Jim winked as he leaned one hip against the door jamb. So you got things worked out with Jami? Told her how you feel, and she told you she loves you too, and now you're happily ever after etc. and whatnot? Not exactly. Things had been going so well between him and Jami, he actually hadn't wanted to bring up his feelings for her in case it ruined what they did have. Cade, his cousin prompted. Well, no. But things are really good right now, you know? He shrugged, reaching for his phone once more, pulling up the calculator app and pretending great interest in it. So what if she doesn't love me the way I love her? If this is how things are, then this is good enough for me. His cousin was silent long enough for Cade to glance up. Jim was frowning thoughtfully at him. Is it? He finally asked. Cade wasn't sure, but he didn't say that out loud. Sure. What me and Jami have right now is great. And you don't think that's because she loves you as much as you love her? He shook his head. I don't know. But if she doesn't, then me telling her how I feel could potentially screw up what we do have. Shaking his head, Jim straightened away from the door. There you go, worrying again. Just tell her, give her something meaningful, and have faith it'll work out for the best. With a parting wave, his cousin strolled away from the office, shaking his head and muttering, and he's supposed to be the smart one? Cade wondered how smart he really was. Unconsciously, his hand dropped to the pocket of his jeans, where the ring box lay. He'd been carrying it around since last Friday, when he picked it up from the jeweler. It had been a surreal experience, going into the jewelry store with the gold they'd panned, to discuss styles and possibilities. The jeweler had told him it was completely feasible, and suggested a thin, simple band to make the most of the gold he and Jami had found together. And now he had it in his pocket. Cade swallowed, worrying over his cousin's words. He felt like he was getting ready to propose to Jami, which was stupid, because she was already his wife. But the idea of pulling out a ring and telling her how he really felt about her. It was terrifying. And for some strange reason, also filled him with hope. Shaking his head, he tried to push his worries aside and focus on his work. He must have succeeded too, because he wasn't sure how long had passed when he heard a noise at the door and looked up again, hopefully. Jami had mentioned she'd stop by today with lunch again, and they could go on another picnic. Was it lunchtime already? Apparently not, because Bianca stood in the door. She was posed, of course it was a pose, for maximum effect, with one hand high on the jam, drawing attention to her height and elegance in that fancy dress. She's got nothing on Jami in her little pink sundress. Her wedding dress. The realization that his ex-girlfriend managed to draw zero interest from him actually made Cade smile slightly. "Hello, honey," Bianca said in that husky voice she'd only used when she wanted something. And he almost rolled his eyes. Instead, he stifled his sigh and asked as politely as he could, "What do you want, Bianca?" It was the invitation she'd been waiting for, apparently, because she dropped her hand and sauntered slowly, was she trying to be sexy, into the office, trailing one finger along the surface of his workbench as she did so. She held his gaze, and he saw the heat there, heat he knew was 100% fake. Was she trying to seduce him? The thought made Cade's lips twitch again. She must have taken that as a good sign, because her smile grew victorious as she reached the other side of his desk and faced him across it. "Do I need a reason to come visit you?" she asked in that same sultry voice. Her audacity was pretty funny. "Yeah, I think you do. Considering how we left things a few years back, when you betrayed me and broke my heart, and what I told you last week." Her fake pout looked ridiculous. Well, she dragged one manicured nail through a spilled pile of powder on the desk from that morning's experiments. "I came back to see if you'd reconsidered our offer. Magic Meal's formula for pregnant Maras is remarkable, based on your results, Anne. I told you I had no intention of selling." She ignored his interruption as she sauntered. Was it possible to saunter in heels, around the edge of the desk? He stood, determined to meet her head-on. "Are you certain?" she breathed, her finger going to her plump, red, perfect lower lip in an obvious attempt to draw his attention. "My bosses are willing to pay big bucks." This was getting laughable. Deciding it'd be petty to point out she just had that finger knuckle deep in horse feed, Cade sighed and shook his head. "Bianca, you and I are through. I'm through doing any more favors for you, and I'm sure as hell not going to sell you or your bosses anything which will help you get ahead of my company." He let his voice go all icy. Again. She lowered her chin and peeked up at him through her lashes, having reached his side of the desk. "Oh, Cade," she breathed playfully, "what we had together was so good, wasn't it? Just imagine." And that's when she tripped on her ridiculous heels and pitched forward into his arms. Jami caught herself humming as she approached the stables, cooler in hand. If she could whistle, she would. I wonder why I can't whistle. Surely if someone could just teach me properly, I'd know how. Grinning, she thought of Cade's tongue and all the impressive things it could do. He could whistle, she was certain of it. Maybe his tongue could teach her tongue how to. Wait, what had she been thinking about? Giggling at herself, Jami realized she was blushing. Well, why not? Cade was amazing in bed. And on the couch. And in the shower. All things considered, it was maybe a good idea that Decker had moved out for a little while. Things between her and Cade were just wonderful. They were partners in every way which mattered, it felt like. And no, she hadn't been brave enough to bring up the L word yet, but today. Well, today she'd told him she was bringing him a picnic lunch again, and was hoping they could sit and talk. And maybe she'd grow enough guts to tell him how she really felt. Last week's conversation with Tessa and Joy had been a real confidence boost. She hadn't run home and told Cade she loved him, but she'd spent the weekend trying to show him. And she thought maybe, based on how wonderful the last few days were, he understood. There was a possibility they might have a real marriage. A marriage like he and that Bianca chick would have had. Not for the first time, not even for the 5th time, Jami found herself wondering about Cade's ex-girlfriend and why they broke up. At one point, they'd been close to marriage, at least, according to his family. That marriage would have been a real one, based on mutual affection and, dare she think it, love. With a sigh, Jami forced a smile and waved at the ranch hands working with the horses in the corral, then ducked into the cooler stables. Jim was probably in here somewhere, but she wasn't there to see the cheerful Cauldron cousin. No, she was here to see her husband. Gripping the cooler's handle, she hurried her steps toward Cade's office along the back of the building. This place was a maze back here, with all the rooms and offices and storage areas needed by a big operation like the racehorses of Cauldron Valley Ranch, but she knew exactly where to go. As she drew closer, she heard the murmur of voices, but assumed they were coming from one of the other rooms. A woman's throaty laugh drifted down the hall, and Jami wondered if Tessa was visiting Bob or something. Didn't he have an office around here? Shrugging, Jami hefted the cooler again and headed for the open door of Cade's office. But when she stepped inside, she stopped short. There was Cade, all right, standing behind his desk where she expected him. But his hair looked mussed, as if someone had run their fingers through it. His face was flushed. And there was a woman in his arms. A beautiful, elegant, tall and skinny woman in his arms. She had perfect dark hair and perfect legs and perfect heels, and a perfect light green dress clinging to non-existent curves. And as Jami watched, she tilted her head back, causing that perfect hair to cascade down her back, and let out a perfect, sensual laugh, thrusting her breasts into Cade's chest. Bianca, Cade growled, the name drawn out as if he were used to it. The cooler hit the ground. Maybe it was that sound, or maybe it was the little choked sob which escaped Jami's lips. Something alerted Cade to her presence, and his lovely green eyes turned to her, looking startled and a little scared. Well, he should be. She'd just caught her husband, with another woman in his arms. And not just another woman, but his ex-girlfriend. A perfectly perfect woman with long legs and no curves and perfect everything. With a sob, Jami realized that's what Cade wanted, what he had wanted all along. This was the reason he'd decided to contract a marriage of convenience. This was why she didn't hold his heart. Because the woman he'd wanted to marry looked like this. And Jami could never compete. This was a mistake. This entire marriage was a mistake. Pressing her hand to her lips, in an attempt to hold in her tears, Jami turned and hurried away. Dimly, she heard Cade, her husband, calling her name, but she didn't stop. Couldn't. All she knew was she had to get as far away from him as possible. Unthinking, she ran through the stable, her stupid, imperfect sandals flapping against the concrete floor as she burst into the sunlight. A few of the hands working the horses turned to her, but as the tears finally began to flow, they all grew blurry and distant. Choking on her heartbreak, Jami turned toward the distant road and overlook, and began to run. Jami. Cade heard his call echo around his office and down the hall, but he was met only with the sound of his wife's hurried footsteps as she ran from him. With a growl, he pushed Bianca back up onto her ridiculous heels, and stepped around her, intent on getting to Jami. The look on her face had been heartbreaking, and it didn't take a rocket scientist to understand it. Thanks to Bianca's attempts at manipulation, Jami had just walked in on him holding another woman. Cade. Bianca sounded a little breathless. Where are you going? For the first time in a long while, he wasn't worried about something. No, he was furious. Wheeling around, he jabbed a finger toward his ex. I'm going after Jami. She was hurt by what she saw, and I'm going to make sure she understands it wasn't what it looked like. Bianca's smile looked as if she was trying to be brave as she smoothed her hair back. What did it look like? I'm sure, to her, it looked like I was holding you. I have to explain to Jami it was just your stupid shoes tripping you, and I caught you, and that was it. Now, Bianca tried that throaty chuckle again, dismissively flicking her fingers as she sauntered toward him. Oh, pooh, you don't mean that about my shoes. And besides, she stopped in front of him, her grin looking slyer and less appealing than she likely thought. Who is this Jami anyhow? Your new girlfriend? She clucked her tongue as she reached for his cheek. Really, Cade, I thought you had better taste than that. Livid now, Cade caught her wrist before she could touch him again, and had to force himself to breathe evenly. He'd never hurt a woman before, and didn't intend to start now, no matter how angry she made him with her hurtful words. About Jami. I have wonderful taste. I broke up with you, didn't I? He growled. She pouted, attempting to tug her hand away. Oh, Cade. Jami is my wife. Bianca froze, eyes wide. And Cade dropped her hand, sneering as if he'd stepped in some of Moonbeam's manure. No, strike that, he thought more of manure than he did of Bianca di Sarno. If you step foot on Cauldron Valley Ranch again, I will have you prosecuted for trespassing. This property is not open to you anymore. If you or your company attempts to contact me or my family again, I will meet with our lawyer about filing an order against you, and possibly a lawsuit for what you stole from me. She was gripping her wrist, pulling it tight against her chest as she watched him with eyes which looked increasingly frantic. Barely controlling his anger, Cade stepped to one side and pointed at the door. Get out of my office, Bianca. Get off my family's property. Get out of Cauldron Valley and go back to Boise, where you belong. If you contact me again, you will regret it. What are you going to do? She whispered. For now, I'm going to wait for you to leave before I lock my office, because I don't trust you any farther than I could throw an angry badger, and then? He blew out a breath as he dragged his hand through his hair. I'm going to save my marriage. He watched as she thrust her chin into the air and marched haughtily toward the door. As if he were the one to hurt her. As if she had a right to be bitter. She paused at the door and hesitated. He vowed, whatever she said to him, he'd meet with stony silence, because that's all she deserved. But she didn't even turn around. No, she must have reconsidered, because she stuck up her nose and kept walking, through the stables and toward the parking area. Cade breathed out a sigh of relief and lunged for his hat. He didn't know where Jami had gone, but he knew he was going after her. He grabbed the keys to the golf cart for good measure. He'd check the path back toward the houses first, and then, maybe. As he was locking his office behind him, because he really didn't trust Bianca not to come back and snoop again, he realized he could ask the hands who were working with the horses out front. Maybe they'd seen which direction she'd gone. Either way, he was going after her. The ring was still a bulge in his pocket, and he shook his head as he jammed his hat on and strode toward the sunlight. An hour ago, he'd been worried about how to tell Jami he loved her. Now he was worried he might not have the chance. I hope I'm not too late. Chapter 10. Jami was certain her heart was breaking, which should be impossible, but there it was. As she ran, she was gulping in big gulps of air, and couldn't tell if it was because she just wasn't used to exercise, or because she was crying too hard to breathe. Or maybe because her heart was breaking. Or maybe it was a heart attack. Dear heavens, I've gone loopy. With a sob, she pushed her way through the long grasses at the overlook, away from the spot she and Cade had parked for their picnics, and collapsed against the tree where he'd stood as he'd first explained what he wanted from a wife. Unable to support herself any longer, although again, not sure if that was grief or general unhealthiness, Jami placed her hand against the trunk and sank to her knees. Before her, the beauty of the Montana landscape spread out before her, but she couldn't see it. Didn't want to see it. Because that beauty reminded her of Cade's words that day, when he'd told her he needed a wife and didn't have time to look for one. She'd been the one to bring up the modern marriages of convenience, and oh, how she regretted that now. Because if he hadn't been intrigued, if they hadn't kissed here under this fir tree, if she hadn't agreed to become his wife, if she hadn't gone and fallen in love with him, her heart wouldn't hurt this much. Again, fairly certain it was the pain of seeing him in the arms of another woman. Not an actual heart attack. Frowning, Jami flattened her palm against her chest and admitted she had no way of knowing for certain. Maybe a heart attack would be easier. The sound of tires crunching on gravel and dirt had her turning. The golf cart was pulling up to the overlook, and she could see Cade's broad hat from here. She pushed herself lower, hoping he wouldn't see her here. Jami? Jami, I can see you there. Damn. She squeezed her eyes shut, not wanting to face him right now. She didn't want to think of why he'd followed her. To explain why she caught him all but making out with another woman? No thank you, go away. Just go away. I'm not leaving you here, Jami. His boots thudded against the ground as he came closer, his strides long and sure. I'm not going away. Double damn. Why had he bothered? If it wasn't to explain, Jami's eyes flew open on a gasp. Was he here to tell her the truth of things? To explain how she was going to have to get used to him having a woman on the side? And not just any woman, but the woman he loved? The woman he loved, which is why he couldn't love her. Incensed now, Jami scrambled to her feet, supporting herself on the tree's trunk. To hell with that, I want a divorce, she blurted as he reached the fir tree, and she was vindicated to see him rear back, his eyes widening under the brim of his hat. What? He blurted. Why did he look like she'd stabbed him or something? His face had paled so suddenly, she was worried for him. Was he surprised? Surely not. Surely he didn't think she was a complete and utter nincompoop, to stand there and let her husband cheat on her. She raised her chin, fighting back tears. I want a divorce. Why? His voice was little more than a croak. Maybe he was the nincompoop, because, she began slowly, as if this was a difficult concept, it is clear to me now that this was a bad idea. She shook her head slightly and tried to draw a steadying breath, but wasn't sure it was working. Trying to control her voice, she continued. This marriage, even if it was convenient for both of us, was wrong, when it's clear you still have feelings for Bianca. I know you wanted to marry her, but that's no reason to enter a marriage of convenience with me. It's not fair to any of us. What? He pushed his hat up on his forehead and rested his other hand on his hip. What are you talking about? She squinted, studying him without being too obvious. Had he hit his head or something? Why was this so difficult to understand? A divorce, Cade, she tried again. I can't be married to a man who doesn't love me. I thought I could, I thought I understood what modern-day marriages of convenience are all about. She shook her head sadly, resting more of her weight on her hand on the tree trunk. Turns out years of research goes down the drain after 2 weeks of actually living it. I know you're just in this marriage because you needed a wife, and I thought that was enough for me, but it's... She squeezed her eyes shut. It's not, she whispered, then met his gaze again, willing him to understand she wasn't joking. I need your heart too, Cade, and since she has it, it's not fair. You're right. And Jami's tears, which she'd been doing so well to hold off, sprang back into her eyes. He wasn't supposed to agree. One hand was still pressed against the tree's trunk, but the other rose to grab at her chest again, certain she could feel her heart breaking in half. He blew out a breath and squeezed his temples between one thumb and middle finger. It was a habit she'd noticed when he was thinking, or worrying, about something, but the sight of how large those strong hands of his were made her chest ache even worse. You're right, he repeated softer, his eyes hidden by his palm. It wouldn't be fair to you, or me, to marry you while I still loved Bianca. Just hearing her name on his lips made Jami want to throw up. Then he dropped his hand. But I don't. He pierced her with an intense green stare. I don't love her. Can I tell you about her? He didn't love her? Then why had he been cuddling with her? Jami didn't think her heart could take any more of this roller coaster, so she refused to feel hope at his words. Numbly, she nodded. Because, despite everything, she didn't think he'd lie to her, and she wanted to know what he'd say. Cade took a step forward, one arm out as if he wanted to hold her, but he tucked his thumbs into his belt at the last moment and rocked back on his heels. He closed his eyes and tipped his head back to the sky. I met Bianca a few years ago, and was flattered by her attention. She was so darn sophisticated, and I guess I was intrigued by her. She started hanging around more and more, being real interested in my job, and he shrugged. Well, I guess I liked the idea of her attention. I liked her. She's very pretty, Jami said dully. Cade snorted and dropped his gaze back to her. She is, and she knows it. She also knows she's meant for bigger and better things than Cauldron Valley, at least, that's what she used to say sometimes, when she wasn't flirting with me and making me feel like the most important man in the world. Jami didn't want to hear this. She pulled her hand in, curling both arms around her stomach, to stop the nausea his words caused. You loved her, she whispered. It wasn't a question, but he shrugged. I thought I did. She asked me all sorts of questions about my job and magic meals, and I was happy to answer. I told her everything she wanted to know about my proprietary blends, and how I came up with new supplement combinations. The trust he'd shown Bianca made Jami wince. He'd done that for her too, hadn't he? He crossed his arms in front of his chest. And just when I thought things were getting serious, she left town. Oh, not on a whim, no. He shook his head. Bianca left Cauldron Valley because she'd accepted a job offer from one of my biggest competitors over in Boise. A national company with an entire division specializing in equine nutritional supplements. Sucking in a breath, Jami's head snapped up to meet his gaze. Cade nodded. She took everything she'd learned from me and magic meals, and sold that knowledge to a big competitor. I realized then and there that our relationship had meant nothing to her, other than the chance to get ahead in this business. The way he told the story, his voice bland, told her he was long over whatever hurt she'd caused. But Jami couldn't imagine. I'm sorry, she whispered, aching for his pain as well as her own. He shrugged. I haven't seen her in 2 years. She came back to town last week to try to talk me into selling her company the blend I feed Moonbeam. They seem to think there's a secret to healthy twin foals. There was a secret, but she suspected had more to do with Bob's bloodlines, Jim's care, and Cade's nutrition than a magic button. Still, she latched onto his confession. Bianca came to see you last week and you didn't tell me? Didn't think to tell your wife that your ex-girlfriend was sniffing around? And for the first time, Cade smiled. It was a tight smile, and she wasn't sure what to make of it, but it made something in her chest flutter again. Oh dear, another heart attack? I didn't tell you, wife, because I didn't think it mattered. I told her to get lost. Today she showed back up, and was doing everything in her power to get me to say yes to the sale. It was clear she was desperate. I'm not sure if she actually tripped or if it was a ruse to put her arms around me, but, he shrugged. That was what happened. I caught her, and put her back on her feet. Of course. No matter how he felt about her, Cade Cauldron couldn't allow a lady to hurt herself. You weren't hugging her? She asked cautiously, almost afraid to hope. Nope. He sounded almost cheerful as he shook his head. And I didn't touch her for more than a few seconds, which you were unlucky enough to witness. If you'd hung around a bit longer, you would have seen me giving her an earful. About what? About how if I ever find out she's on the property, or if she or her company attempts to contact me, I'll be talking to our lawyer. What she did, stealing my ideas, was illegal, and I think she knows I can make life difficult for them if I want. Swallowing, Jami stepped away from the tree. You really don't love her anymore? He dropped his arms to his side and took 2 steps toward her, stopping arm's reach away. I think it's possible I never really did. Not the way, he jerked his head to one side, as if biting off his words. I mean, I know now what I felt for her was what she manipulated me into feeling, and it's nothing like what I feel for. Again, he shook his head, and holding her breath, she prompted him. 4. Swallowing, he met her eyes. I love you, Jami. I've been worried for weeks because I thought you were only in this. He gestured back and forth between them, this for connivance's sake. Reaching for her, she let him take her hand. But I've fallen in love with you, he whispered, and can't stand the thought of you being married to me and not loving me. So. He loved her? Jami was almost afraid to breathe. So, she whispered, her entire being hanging on the balance. Without dropping her hand, he reached into his pocket, fumbling a bit as he pulled out a box. A box? A ring box. With one hand, he popped the box open, and she saw, nestled on black velvet, a simple gold band. Wide-eyed, she dragged her gaze from the ring to his expression, searching it for any hint this could be a joke. Did he? Was he? He loved her. Cade's smile was a little lopsided when he confessed, I thought about going down on one knee, but now that the moment is here, I can't seem to make myself let go of you. His chuckle sounded desperate. Also, I'm not so sure my knees would work, I'm real nervous. Of course he was worried. That's what he did. And Jami felt the tightness in her chest ease. She might not be sure about anything else right now, but one thing she knew for certain was that she loved this man, and she'd do anything she could to ease his worries. Forever. So she squeezed his hand. You don't have to be nervous, she assured him. His gulp was audible, as he held up the ring. Jami, I made this, well, I had it made, from the gold we found together on our first date. I wanted a way to show you how important you've become to me. Although he was holding up the ring, she couldn't drag her gaze away from his to look at it. He'd done something so incredibly sweet for her it could only mean one thing. Jami, I love you. And Jami exhaled. With a shaking hand, gripping his in her other hand like a lifeline, she reached for the ring. She believed his words, had to believe his words, because why else would he do something so incredibly heartfelt? When she picked up the ring, he closed the box and slid it back into the pocket of his jeans, but she continued to stare down at it. Maybe it was easier to look at the ring than him? I love you too, she confessed in a whisper. I thought you just wanted a wife, any wife, and when I heard, from your family, about how you once wanted to marry Bianca, she shook her head and finally forced herself to meet his gaze. I thought that meant you'd had your heart broken, that was the kind of marriage you'd wanted. So when I saw her with you today. Sweetheart, I promise you that Bianca will never bother us again. The way he said it told her he meant it. With a deep breath, she lifted the ring between them. Do you really mean this? What you said? He smiled, the worry lines of his forehead easing away. I love you, Jami. Will you marry me? Oh. Cade, she smiled. We are married. But he wasn't joking. Will you be my wife in every way that matters? I want a wife who will love me, even when we're fighting or disagreeing. I want a wife who trusts me enough to talk to me when she starts having doubts. I want a wife who'll stand beside me and meet all of life's challenges head-on, caring about my feelings as much as I care about hers. Without hesitation, Jami slid the ring onto her fourth finger, where a wedding band belonged. Then she lifted her palm to his cheek. I would be honored, Cade. But only if you'll be my husband in those same ways. He dropped her hand and wrapped his arms around her waist. I love you, Dr. Jami Boatright Cauldron. As much as I love you? Smiling, he leaned down. We can spend the rest of our lives debating who loves the other one more. Stretching up to reach him, she inhaled his perfect scent, comforting her after the emotional upheaval of the last hour. I think that sounds lovely, husband. And when their lips met, Jami knew she'd be able to write her next book without trouble. Because marriages of convenience really did work. Cade sat back in his chair as the Sunday evening conversation swirled around him, smiling. Beside him, Jami bantered with Jim and Decker, and teased Pops right alongside Tessa, but she did it while holding Cade's hand under the table. Experimentally, he squeezed her fingers, loving the feel of the gold ring between them. Sure enough, she finished what she was saying and turned to Cade. He didn't say anything, but when he winked, she smiled and blushed slightly. "Good to see marriage is working out for you," drawled Decker. "I'll come by to pick up the rest of my stuff sometime this week, and you can have the extra bedroom for." "We don't want to kick you out," Jami hurried to assure him. "It's your house too." And Cade wanted to agree with her claim, but as much as he loved his brother, he had to admit the privacy had been nice. So he kept his mouth shut. But Deck just shrugged. "It's cool. Pops doesn't mind me hanging out here, do you?" "Course not." "It's good to have you back home," the old man called from the head of the table. "I dunno," Ted drawled, "your feet smell pretty bad." Deck retaliated by tossing a dinner roll at Ted's head. "Decker Cauldron." Griselda gasped from her side of the table. "If your grandmother could see you now." "Hey, Ted," called out Pops, holding up his hand, "if you're not going to eat that." When Ted tossed the roll to Pops, the old man dropped it under the edge of the tablecloth. They all heard Herman's happy snorts. "Did you bring the pig into the dining room?" Griselda gasped again. When Pops shrugged, Wyatt leaned over to the housekeeper. "Herman's part of the family, you know," he said seriously. She just huffed and reached for her fork with narrowed eyes. "Hate to see what she's got planned for revenge." What had they been speaking about? "Oh yeah, you sure you don't mind?" he asked Deck in a low voice. "We could make it work out, if you wanted to move back home." But his brother shrugged again. "Nah. I'm going to have to make space for my family sometime, so it might as well be now." "Family?" Jami asked with a smile. "Didn't you hear?" Deck's green eyes twinkled. "All us Cauldrons have to get married and start popping out babies." Tessa giggled, and Jami's hand dropped to her stomach. It was too early for her to be pregnant, and they'd chatted about it a time or two. Cade wasn't sure he was ready either, but the thought of Jami carrying his kid, well, it always made him proud, and mushy, and of course, worried. Pops called out, "You know I approve." "So you're gonna be next, Deck?" "It won't be me, that's for sure," Wyatt declared. "Ted? Jim?" Pops nodded to each of them. While Ted just shrugged, Jim spoke up, twisting his fork between his fingers. "I'm not against it, Pops, but I have to find the right woman. One who brings me," he nodded to Cade and Jami, "and Bob and Tessa, joy." "Joy?" Tessa repeated, narrowing her eyes thoughtfully, and Cade wondered what she was thinking. Then Jami distracted him by leaning over and placing a kiss on his cheek. It was a simple move, something they'd already done dozens of times. But the feel of her lips against his skin never failed to get his blood pumping, and he wondered how long before he could drag his wife back to their house for some alone time. He smiled at her. "I love you," she whispered under his family's crazy chatter, and as he lifted her hand to his lips, brushing a kiss against the gold ring she wore, he knew there was one thing he never had to worry about. "I love you too. Forever." Epilogue. After supper that evening, Jim went back to his house, wondering what the two new women in his family were concocting. He'd seen something pass between them when he'd said he wanted someone who would bring him joy, and he could tell, well, something wasn't right. He might not be the brightest of all the Cauldron cousins, heck, Bob had a doctorate, but he could tell something was up. It didn't matter though. He sank down on his couch and told Alexa to play his book on horse training. Maybe he still couldn't read well, but he was learning more every day. He could remember just about anything after hearing it once. If the words would just stop dancing on the page, he'd be able to read. But those letters did crazy things. He leaned his head onto the back cushions to concentrate on the words Alexa was playing for him. And in his mind, he saw a pretty curly-haired redhead walking down the aisle of the church with her arm entwined with Tessa's. He needed someone like that pretty girl. She would be his joy.